Chapter 21:67. The battle at the bottom of the White Nectar Sea was extremely massive. All of the heavenly human tribe and heavenly gods on the divine tree could sense the surging energy at the bottom of the sea. How big was the White Nectar Sea? This was a sea that was many times larger than the continent of a small world. At this moment, the entire White Nectar Sea was in a frenzy. Tsunamis over 100,000 feet tall were surging. Golden light erupted from the bottom of the sea, and it was as if a sun had appeared over the White Nectar Sea. This is the power of light. What's going on? Could it be that the heavenly light goddess has already completed her transformation and is fighting our paramount heavenly gods? Gasp! How powerful must she be to dare to do this? Are we going to help them? Do you want to die? Or do you not know what to do? A battle between them is not something we can intervene in. A heaven pioneer stage, great general scolded. All of the other heavenly human tribe, powerful beings, nodded in agreement. Their attacks were unable to break through the defenses of the paramount heavenly gods, and any clash between the paramount heavenly gods would be able to kill them. A battle of this caliber was not something they could intervene in. Activate the divine tree's defenses. Don't let the divine tree be toppled by the battle between the paramount heavenly gods. At this moment, the heavenly slaughter god had already issued a command to the heavenly human tribe powerful beings. The heavenly gods, who loved to fight, were now making a defensive request. It was quite apparent that no one dared to intervene in this battle. Everyone chose to watch from the sidelines. All of the heavenly human tribe powerful beings channeled their power into a certain spell formation. The dark green light barrier soared into the sky and wrapped around the huge divine tree, protecting it tightly. At this moment, the huge wave was already rolling toward the divine tree. It was extremely fast, and the kinetic energy it carried seemed to be able to destroy the world. However, the massive waves were all kept at bay by the light barrier, and the divine tree remained completely unscathed. All of the nervous, heavenly human tribe powerful beings finally felt a sense of security at the sight of this light barrier. Whoosh! A crescent-shaped blade, aura, suddenly split the pure white ocean and coincidentally collided with the green light shield. Boom! Energy exploded forth. All of the heavenly human tribe powerful beings felt a violent tremor run through their bodies. The light barrier began to crack open at a rate discernible to the naked eye. A blue-water humanoid was panting heavily as it pressed itself against the light barrier. It was none other than the heavenly sea god, who had been struck by the light barrier. Heavenly sea god, are you all right? None of the heavenly human tribe powerful beings would have thought that the almost invincible heavenly sea god would appear before them in this form. This was simply unimaginable. The heavenly sea god didn't have time to deal with this army. He was just about to flee when a few more terrifying crimson crescent blades tore through the ocean toward him. Heavenly light goddess. He roared and slammed his palm toward the blood moon crescent blade. A giant ocean hand that was 100,000 feet tall blotted out the sky and the sun. It gathered the boundless power of the ocean and slammed down toward the blade. Boom, boom, boom. There were several explosions in the distance. He slapped away the energy on the surface of the blade projection, revealing the boundless power of light within it. This power of light could purify and pierce through all things. It was like a holy crescent moon that tore apart the gigantic palm before continuing toward the heavenly sea god. No, an expression of despair appeared on the heavenly sea god's face as his body was sliced into several pieces. The radiant crescent moon continued onward. Then, under the horrified gazes of the heavenly humans, the crescent moon sliced through the cracked green barrier. It continued on its way to the divine tree, slicing the divine tree into several pieces as if it were butter. Rumble, the massive divine tree collapsed again. The heavenly human tribe powerful beings fled in panic. They were truly scared. The heavenly sea god and the divine tree had been sliced into several pieces right before their very eyes. How could they not be scared? All they could do was run as far away as they could. At this moment, an exquisitely beautiful woman in a black robe with red eyes and a blood moon scythe on her shoulder broke through the ocean and made her way toward the heavenly sea god. All of the heavenly human tribe powerful beings were dumbstruck upon seeing the heavenly light goddess appearance. This was the heavenly light goddess? Why was her style completely different from what they had imagined? Wasn't she supposed to be holy and mighty? Why was she wearing a dark style? However, they also knew that this really was the light goddess, as her extremely pure power of light could not be faked. Boom! A massive splash erupted. Another pale head, made of clouds and mist, appeared. There was a divine halo above its head that reflected heaven and earth like a mirror. Light, you can't do anything to us. If you continue to fight, you'll only be stalling for time. If you live on, you won't be able to escape. The heavenly heaven god's voice was extremely imposing and ethereal. Is that so? I don't think I'm just stalling for time. The divine goddess of light looked at the heavenly sea god, who had just reformed his body. A faint smile appeared on her face as she looked at his trembling divine halo. See, how much longer can you last? The heavenly sea god wanted to beat someone up upon hearing this. I didn't think that you would do something as despicable as taking advantage of others. The heavenly sea god gritted his teeth and chuckled coldly. The light goddess expression remained unchanged. At least I'm better than some traitors. The heavenly sea god, light goddess, you've changed. You become more adept at insulting others. You're no longer as transcendent and ethereal as you were in the past. Now that the light goddess possessed the life form of the Tai-Chu continent, she would become more powerful, but she would also become more insignificant. It was unknown whether this was a good or a bad thing. In any case, this was a bad thing for the heavenly sea god. Women all held grudges. Even though she didn't say it, the light goddess was still chasing after him. So how could she not hold a grudge? At this moment, the light goddess was already charging toward him with her scythe. If things continued like this, the heavenly sea god really wouldn't be able to hold on any longer. Heavenly heaven, let's surround and kill her. The heavenly sea god yelled in a panicked voice. As soon as he finished speaking, the divine ring above his head erupted with light that swept out in all directions like an ocean, transforming the sky into rippling blue seawater. Heavenly god technique, mystic realm ocean. Rumble, the sound of water surging erupted. The ocean and the sky began to transform. The rippling seawater suddenly turned into a sinister purple color, and an even more bizarre, smiling face appeared in the center of the ocean. It had no aura, but to put it more accurately, the ocean was its aura. The light goddess finally sensed danger at this moment. Right at this moment, the space around her instantly transformed into countless chaotic dimensions. From the outside, it was as if the light goddess had been twisted into many different forms, such as flat planes, lines, or even forms that transcended this world. Heavenly God technique, dimensional strike. The two heavenly gods finally unleashed their trump cards, and they crashed toward the heavenly light goddess. Chapter 2168. The ghostly purple ocean slowly crashed down upon her. There seemed to be countless sounds of laughter and cries reverberating through the air. The heavenly light goddess raised her head and smiled at the sight of the eerie, smiling face in the ocean. At this moment, the distorted dimension was already closing in on her. The heavenly light goddess slashed her scythe toward the dimension before her without any hesitation. A vast crimson crescent moon pierced through heaven and earth, but it exploded into countless particles of light upon colliding with the distorted dimension. This was a dimensional attack that could even distort and disintegrate light. The woman in black wanted to continue attacking, but her arms and legs were suddenly severed by an invisible dimensional attack. Her left hand became a ball that expanded infinitely. Her right hand became a piece of paper, and her long, slender legs became a line that detached from her body. Her crimson blood sprayed into the air before transforming into all types of shapes and forms, creating an extremely bizarre and terrifying sight to behold. This was the first time the heavenly light goddess had been injured since she obtained her new body. Not only did that excruciating pain enrage her, but it also made her heart feel extremely real. A peculiar light also appeared in her eyes, as if she had attained enlightenment. So, this was what it felt like to be alive. At this moment, the eerie smiling face in the sky suddenly unleashed a wave-like ripple. The woman's movements were affected by the ripple, and she felt as if she had been submerged in a boundless ocean. She was unable to control her own body. The heavenly light goddess body was immobilized for an instant. At this moment, a purple dragon had already descended from the purple ocean before opening its gargantuan mouth and instantly engulfed her body before melting it into nothingness. Peace and quiet returned to heaven and earth. However, the heavenly earth god and the heavenly sea god didn't dare to let their guard down and continued to maintain their paramount heavenly god spell techniques. They knew that the heavenly light goddess couldn't be killed so easily. Sure enough, a speck of golden light appeared in the air before growing brighter and brighter, as if it were a light source imbued with boundless light and future. It instantly became even more dazzling than the sun, so much so that even the gigantic smiling face in the purple ocean couldn't help but narrow its eyes. "Continue attacking." The heavenly sea god roared with rage. The heavenly heaven god's hair and beard stood on end as he unleashed his paramount heavenly power. Countless dimensional attacks distorted light and devoured it. However, the intensity of the light was a little excessive. It actually started to penetrate through the dimensions and tear through the barriers, as if it wanted to penetrate through all the worlds. At this moment, a gigantic pillar of water with a diameter of over 3 million feet fell from the sky. It was imbued with the boundless power of a paramount heavenly god, and it even caused the surrounding space to tremor and transform into a pure ocean. Purple became the dominant color, overshadowing the blossoming radiance. But no matter how they resisted, there was still a bit of golden light shining inside. Light is eternal. It is the one and only. It is the proof of the existence of all things in heaven and earth. Everything in the world needs me, so how can you obstruct my power? A cold and indifferent voice rang out. The golden light began to tear apart all dimensions and disintegrate all the ocean waves. Not good. Retreat. The heavenly heaven god's expression shifted drastically as he hurtled back in retreat. The heavenly sea god also began to fly backward. The golden light was like an explosion. In an instant, the power of light spread out in all directions at the speed of light. The light penetrated and melted everything. Everything, whether tangible or intangible, was purified into light particles by the light. The two heavenly gods were unable to evade in time, and their bodies were instantly shattered by the light. A gargantuan figure began to appear from within the light. She was extremely tall, at least 1 million feet tall. Her head was above the heavens, and her feet were on the ground. She wore a golden holy robe, and she appeared to be holy and inviolable. However, her eyes were a crimson color, and it was as if they were imbued with extreme slaughter and destruction. The heavenly human tribe cultivators were struck by a sense of shock and awe at the sight of such a contradictory individual. It was as if they had seen a piece of exquisite art. Meanwhile, the two paramount heavenly gods' expressions shifted drastically as if they had seen a ghost. This is the heavenly light goddess full power form, myriad manifestations pagoda. We have to fight with all our might. The two paramount heavenly gods reacted as if they were facing a powerful enemy. If Enlin were here, he would definitely recognize this technique. Back when the heavenly light goddess had attacked the land of eternal light, she had used this technique against Chun Shun, and she had even managed to wound Chun Shun. Now, the heavenly light goddess was unleashing her ultimate technique again. This was a technique that was a little different from the one Enlin had seen in the past. However, her current form was that of a gargantuan beauty. She gave off the feeling that she was a pure life form. Her eyes were also crimson, and there was a crescent moon scythe several thousand kilometers in length hovering behind her. Her appearance was different, but the terrifying pressure she exuded was still the same. A sinister, smiling face emerged from within the purple ocean, and there was a hint of yearning in its eyes as it looked at the woman. It descended toward the woman along with the ocean, as if it were trying to engulf this perfect piece of art. The heavenly light goddess expression remained unchanged in the face of the descending ocean. In fact, there was even a faint smile on her face. Tens of thousands of pristine white arms suddenly appeared behind her, each of which possessed an earth-shattering essence. Roar! A lightning dragon over 500 kilometers in length soared into the sky before exploding into the ocean. Countless bolts of lightning spread for tens of thousands of kilometers, causing the mystic ocean to tremble slightly before it continued to descend. Even the heavenly light goddess essence was unable to stop the descent of the ocean. However, this was only the power unleashed by a single essence. The heavenly light goddess had over 10,000 of them. Over 100 arms danced in the air. The soaring serpent transformed into the poison emperor and rose into the air to kill the ocean. The Flame Realm King unleashed holy flames to incinerate the heavens and boil the ocean. A sharp heavenly saber sliced the ocean in half. Countless crimson spikes that had been tainted by karma rained down like a torrential downpour, and the Death Omen star unleashed billions of souls to tear into the gargantuan smiling face at the center of the ocean. 100 earth-shattering essence images exploded toward the ocean at the same time. The smiling face at the center of the ocean howled with anguish as it laughed. However, it was still descending. It was hurting, but it could still hold on. Interesting. You've endured 1% of my heavenly light manifestation's power, but you still have the courage to face my power head-on. The heavenly light goddess raised her head with a slightly surprised expression on her face, but in the end, she merely waved a hand, upon which the thousands of arms behind her also began to do the same. At this moment, the heavenly heaven god unleashed another dimensional attack upon the heavenly light goddess, but the heavenly light goddess used her countless arms to shatter the dimensional attack once again. Take this, myriad light manifestations. Over 1,000 essence images crashed toward the ocean and the sky at the same time. This was an extremely spectacular scene. It was as if the gods had descended upon the heavenly heaven god. Boundless energy exploded, and the entire sky was filled with mystical phenomena. The gigantic face with the eerie smile was directly blasted into smithereens by the incomparably dazzling Dharma idol. The boundless purple ocean hanging high in the sky was also blasted into countless water droplets by the unimaginable Dharma idol, and then purified into light particles by the light. PFFF. The heavenly sea god spell technique had been nullified, and he was severely wounded by the backlash. Chapter 2169. The all-encompassing pagoda was a manifestation created from light. The heavenly sea god's heavenly god technique had been broken by the light goddess with just 1,000 manifestations. Just how terrifying was this all-encompassing pagoda? The heavenly heaven god's dimensional attack was completely nullified by her 2,000 arms. This meant that if she unleashed her full combat prowess, she would be able to handle the combined attacks of 2 paramount heavenly gods with ease. This was an indication of just how terrifying her true combat prowess was. Just how terrifying would her combat prowess be after she completed her transformation? The heavenly sea god didn't dare to think about it, and neither did the heavenly heaven god. They only had one thought in their minds, and that was to kill the heavenly light goddess. However, how were they supposed to defeat such a powerful light goddess? At this moment, the heavenly sea god was already greeted by the sight of over 1,000 Dharma idols covering heaven and earth. It was as if over 1,000 types of apocalyptic divine might were crashing down upon him, and he had nowhere to run. Boundless ocean. The heavenly sea god let loose an enraged roar as his blue sea divine halo activated to its maximum extent, and cracks began to appear on it. At the same time, its paramount laws carried out an absolute command, and the entire white nectar sea rose into the air and quickly rose into the air. The entire sea had transformed into a shield in order to keep the boundless manifestation attacks at bay. From afar, countless living beings could see that the entire boundless sea had risen up into the air and clashed with countless terrifying powers, and the resulting explosion lit up the entire continent. The heavenly human tribe united army fled in horror, and some of the soldiers who didn't get out of the white nectar sea in time were swept up by the boundless sea and crashed into the manifestation at the center of the sea. The tens of millions of soldiers in Yutong City had naturally witnessed this earth-shattering scene. Even though this place was very far from the white nectar sea, how could they ignore the sight of the 10,000 manifestation pagoda that was 1,000,000 feet tall and the entire white nectar sea? Even a mortal could clearly see the devastation taking place in the distance. The roar of the ocean and the boundless piercing light could be clearly seen by powerful beings with a certain cultivation base, even those in the southern Heavenly Wing Nation or the Buddhist Kingdom of the West, who were situated nearby. This battle was far too massive, and it was destined to shock the entire Tai Chu continent. Yutong City had already entered a state of complete combat readiness. All the soldiers looked at the shock waves of the collision in the distance and felt their hearts tremble inexplicably. The entire white nectar sea had been erected to defend against an attack. Not just an entire sea, but the entire inner sea at the center of the Tai Chu continent. What kind of power did that require? Even Tao integration stage, super mighty figures were unable to fathom what kind of power that was, and they could only stare in awe and wonder from afar. Is this the power of a paramount heavenly god? Every time I see it, I truly feel how insignificant I am. No wonder sect leader in Lin gave the order not to initiate a battle no matter what happens today. So it turns out that a battle between two paramount sky gods has erupted today. Why are the light and the ocean fighting? Also, where's our Godin? He must have gone to do something big, but what if the paramount heavenly god attacks our Yutong City while he's away? Some people felt like Lin wasn't here, so they didn't feel safe. However, their unease gradually subsided when they saw the figure in the jade dress standing atop the city wall. They had a trump card as well. Divine Phoenix Maiden Su Xiaolan was also here, so even if the paramount heavenly gods were to attack, they should be able to hold them off for a while, right? At this moment, Su Xiaolan stood before her with her dragon sparrow sword in her hands, and her pure golden eyes stared at the battle in the distance, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Her original plan was that if Lin was being attacked by the three paramount heavenly gods, she would immediately step into the fray. However, she never would have thought that the heavenly light goddess would be the one to stir things up and completely mess up the situation. It could be said that the heavenly light goddess had become a temporary ally of hers. It had to be said that anything could happen in this world. Some people with insufficient cultivation bases could only see the ocean and the light clashing. However, she knew that this was actually the battlefield where the three paramount heavenly gods were battling. It was just that the heavenly heaven god's power was very difficult to detect. The heavenly light goddess was more powerful than most people could imagine. My current power is about the same as the severely wounded heavenly sea god. I'm still too weak. Su Xiaolan gripped her sword hilt tightly as she looked at the battle between the three paramount heavenly gods, and a peculiar battle intent welled up in her heart. She wanted a battle. Through battle, she wanted to test her Tao. She had rejected the opportunity to sever her past and transcend, as well as the opportunity to transcend beyond the three realms. However, she refused to believe that transcending was the only way to become more powerful. There were other ways for her to become more powerful. She had to find an opportunity through this battle. Even though she was spectating this battle from afar, she could still feel a lot of emotions on the white nectar sea. The light goddess unleashed over 1,000 Tao projections, but she was still unable to break through the white nectar sea's defenses. The heavenly sea god had the entire Tai Chu continent's core ocean power firmly in his hands. This power could even allow the great Tao of heaven and earth to silently support his will. The light goddess was forced back by the pure white ocean, and she was about to be engulfed by the boundless white nectar sea. Even though she was over 1,000,000 feet tall, she was still extremely tiny and insignificant in the face of this ocean. 5,000 Tao projections. The goddess of light suddenly let out a clear shout. Her pristine, long arms each wielded an earth-shattering Tao projection, which she tossed toward the ocean. There were a total of 5,000 Tao projections. Once there was a certain number of Tao projections, a fundamental change would occur. Indescribable Tao projections soared into the heavens and shook the heavens. An indescribably vast amount of top-level energy in Tao realm erupted forth at this moment, shattering the heavens and puncturing the ocean. Boom, boom, boom. The heavenly sea god was struck by a sense of insignificance in the face of this power. He had already unleashed his full power, and this was clearly his home ground. Rumble, the ocean exploded into countless massive balls of water. The light goddess pierced through the ocean and appeared before the heavenly sea god. A crimson moon scythe was slashed toward the heavenly sea god's body, leaving him with nowhere to run. Rip! The heavenly sea god's body was sliced in half. Even his origin authority of the sea was sliced in half. Chapter 2170. The heavenly sea god sensed death. After battling for so long, this was the first time he had sensed death. Not only had his body been sliced in half, but even his essential heavenly god powers had been severed. If the paramount heavenly god powers weren't powerful enough, he would have already ascended into the sky and returned to the heavenly Tao, losing all self-awareness forever. Heavenly sea, this is the consequence of your betrayal. The divine light goddess looked down at her severed body. The pure power of light was still disintegrating the severed body, and the divine light goddess was even trying to purify the heavenly sea god power into particles of light. This was not wishful thinking. She really could do it, and she was already halfway there. The heavenly heaven god attacked the heavenly light goddess from the side in an attempt to buy time for the heavenly sea god. Then, the heavenly light goddess unleashed 3,000 light manifestations toward the heavenly heaven god, severely wounding the heavenly heaven god. No, she's far too powerful. This heavenly light goddess is far too powerful. The divine light goddess turned her dangerous gaze toward the heavenly sea god again. The heavenly sea god wanted to recover his body, but his severed body was being corroded by the power of light, so there was no way he could recover in a short time. If things continued like this, he was going to die. Die. The divine light goddess spoke in an indifferent voice, as if she was pronouncing the heavenly sea god's fate. She raised her crimson moon scythe high above her head. She didn't pretend this time, and an unimaginable holy light erupted from the scythe in her hand. It was like a holy and mighty heavenly judgment scythe, completely devoid of all the violence and slaughter from before. This was clearly a transcendence. The crimson moon scythe fell. The heavenly sea god heaved a faint sigh as he looked at the boundless light engulfing him. So be it. Who would have thought that things would develop to this point? If I die, I'll have nothing left. If I'm still alive, no matter how weak I am, I'll still have a chance to live. The light from the crimson moon scythe completely engulfed the heavenly sea god's body. The holy light purified his body, which was imbued with the paramount power of the ocean, into countless particles of light. Even though his opponent was a paramount heavenly god, he was still unable to resist this absolute purification. The power of light was just that mighty and domineering. However, there was a single drop of liquid within the heavenly sea god's body that was glowing with a peculiar divine light that resisted the invasion of light. It looked very small, but it was extremely sturdy, so sturdy that even the power of light of the goddess of light could not penetrate it. It was also pure and transparent. It was a small liquid, but it reflected the entire world. Not only that, but the vastness of its interior could not be understood even if it was magnified countless times. The liquid began to split. 1 drop became 2 drops, 2 drops became 4 drops, 4 drops became 16 drops, 16 drops became 256 drops. The liquid grew very quickly. The heavenly light goddess discovered this anomaly, and she immediately used her light Dharma idol to bombard her opponent's liquid. However, the liquid was unable to be purified or annihilated at all, and it continued to increase at a terrifying rate. In the end, this rate of increase would reach an astronomical figure. Soon, the liquid converged into a river, and the river began to converge into an ocean. In the end, a brand new ocean appeared before the heavenly light goddess. The ocean was extremely pure. It was an ocean composed of the purest liquid, an unknown liquid that was even purer than water. It was so pure that one would feel as if their entire life had been cleansed with a single glance. It was clean, but it wasn't an ocean that was devoid of nutrients and couldn't sustain life. On the contrary, it contained all types of pure and orthodox substances and energy that could allow all life to thrive here. It looked like a complete ocean that was a mixture of all sorts of things. Yet it was so pure and beautiful that it made one want to sink into it. A living being that was over 1,000,000 feet tall and wielding a golden trident slowly emerged from the center of the ocean. It was none other than the heavenly sea god, who had grown countless times larger. His body was the deepest blue color, as if it could engulf everything. However, it also appeared extremely clear and clean. Most importantly, there were all types of peculiar patterns of the great Tao all over his body. Each and every one of them was a manifestation of the great Tao, and it was as if many things could be born from them. Heavenly light, you force my hand. The heavenly sea god's voice was deep and vast. Heavenly sea god, I've finally forced your Tao idol out. The heavenly light goddess took a deep breath, and light surged forth from within her body as if she was trying to completely dispel the boundless sense of oppression that enveloped her body. You've successfully exhausted my greatest trump card. Are you very happy? The heavenly sea god spoke expressionlessly. As he spoke, the ocean beneath his feet was still expanding in a frenzy, and there was no end in sight. This was clearly a colorless ocean of liquid, but this liquid of unknown composition struck the heavenly light goddess with an indescribable sense of oppression. This was the sense of oppression produced by the heavenly gods when their powers were released to the limit. This power was far too powerful, and it was powerful enough to affect other heavenly gods. If some of the weaker heavenly gods were here, they would probably immediately kneel down and revere the heavenly sea god as the only paramount being. I'm indeed very happy that I've exhausted your trump card. The heavenly light goddess cocked her head to the side with a faint smile, and her body quickly shrank from over 1,000,000 feet tall to the size of a normal human. She had already unleashed her myriad manifestations pagoda, and it would be difficult for her to use it again in a short time. However, this was already enough. She had achieved her goal. Brother C, you. The heavenly heaven god's emotions were extremely turbulent. A sense of sorrow and rage welled up in his heart as he glowered at the black-robed woman standing nearby. Heavenly light slash. The heavenly light goddess slashed her scythe through the air, and a golden slash imbued with the paramount divine might of light surged toward the heavenly sea god. The heavenly sea god stood silently in the center of the ocean. The slash of light pierced through the ocean, but the power of light became smaller and smaller as it traveled, until it finally disappeared. Upon closer inspection, the vortex above the ocean had absorbed the power of light that could purify all things. That's it. The heavenly sea god didn't even attack. Instead, he merely stared at the heavenly light goddess in silence. However, what he saw was the heavenly light goddess back. The heavenly light goddess was about to escape. A streak of golden light sped into the distance at an incredible speed. If this were the heavenly sea god of the past, He would probably be completely powerless in the face of such an insane speed and could only look on helplessly as his opponent escaped. However, he only had to use a single thought now. A massive ocean vortex appeared in front of the heavenly light goddess like a wall of despair, threatening to engulf the streak of golden light. The streak of golden light shuddered violently, and it was stopped in its tracks. Even the heavenly light goddess didn't dare to enter this ocean vortex. Chapter 2171. Reality had proven that once a heavenly god's power reached a certain level, it would strike fear into the hearts of all other heavenly gods. At this moment, the heavenly sea god's paramount heavenly god's power was being suppressed to the maximum. The power he unleashed was far more powerful than the heavenly light goddess had imagined. However, the heavenly light goddess didn't give up just like that. She unleashed her light escape technique again in an attempt to circle around the whirlpool before her. The heavenly sea god willed another whirlpool to appear in front of the heavenly light goddess. The heavenly light goddess quickly turned and tried to circle around it, but the whirlpool only grew larger and larger. In the end, it surrounded her from all directions. Withdraw. The heavenly sea god gripped the air toward the heavenly light goddess. The whirlpool was in the shape of a spherical water ball, and it suddenly contracted toward the heavenly light goddess, creating an unparalleled water pressure that could pulverize everything within it. Heavenly god technique, Dawn. The heavenly light goddess forcefully activated her heavenly god power and unleashed an extremely dazzling light. This light was the light of dawn. It could pierce through all darkness and nothingness, and it could break through all shackles and perilous situations. Not only was it a powerful power of light, but it was also an extremely terrifying power of consciousness and intent realm. Rip! The spherical whirlpool was torn apart by the light. A streak of light flew out from the crack and into the sky. The heavenly sea god's expression shifted drastically, and he immediately pointed his golden trident at the heavenly light goddess. Myriad seas, heavenly prison. One sea after another began to appear around the heavenly light goddess. Some were seas of red flames, some were seas of lightning, and some were spiritual seas that contained all sorts of strange energies. Every single one of these seas was revolving like a strange galaxy, releasing an endless aura. Every ocean here contained the purest power of the ocean. Its greatest characteristic was that it was vast and deep. It was clearly an extremely powerful individual, but it was also connected to each other, forming a whole that could completely envelop and seal its target. All the heavenly light goddess could see was an ocean, and there was no way she could avoid it. She could only choose to unleash her heavenly god power again and use her light power to break through. She finally understood the heavenly sea god's true plan. Her opponent was trying to exhaust the heavenly light god's remaining energy through this kind of endless and forceful exhaustion. Then, she would become a fish waiting to be slaughtered. In terms of how much power the heavenly sea god possessed, the light goddess was no match for the heavenly sea god. After all, the heavenly sea god was in a state where he could avoid being suppressed by the heavenly Tao to the greatest extent. At this moment, the heavenly space god had already closed in on the light goddess. It opened its mouth, and the black clouds and mist in the sky transformed into a series of chains that shot toward the light goddess. This was no ordinary cloud and mist. Instead, it was a spatial chain that was formed from the extreme compression of all the spatial energy in the world. Not only could it seal the surrounding space, but the strength and hardness of the spatial chain itself was also more than 1,000 times that of ordinary space. Even a god of creation would find it difficult to break free after being bound. The goddess of light could not avoid it, so she made a very decisive decision. Ultimate deity art, light of two realms. The goddess of light's heart suddenly began to beat violently, and the divine halo above her head began to tremble nonstop. At the same time, a strange purple-gold light enveloped her body, causing her body to gradually transform into a purple-gold beam of light. This was the light with the most powerful penetrative power. This was the most powerful escape technique that the heavenly light goddess could unleash the light of two realms. If she knew the coordinates of the two worlds, she would even be able to use this beam of light to instantly traverse through the two worlds. It's just an ocean. In my eyes, it's nothing more than a blink of an eye. Countless spatial chains formed a massive net that shot toward the heavenly light goddess. However, after the heavenly light goddess transformed into a purple gold beam of light, her speed once again skyrocketed to an unimaginable level. She could even use the coordinates within the chaos to evade at super light speed. Even the heavenly heaven god, who controlled the entire void, found it difficult to keep up with her speed using spatial chains. How was she supposed to keep up with this? The purple gold beam of light quickly found an opening in the countless spatial chains and escaped from them at an extreme angle and speed. The heavenly sea god was the heavenly sea god's heavenly sea god, so his perception and control over the great Tao of heaven and earth had already reached the extreme limit. Thus, he was still able to capture the heavenly light goddess movements. The heavenly sea god immediately controlled the galaxy-like ocean to intercept the heavenly light goddess. There were so many oceans, and they were enough to completely seal off all of the heavenly light goddess escape routes. The heavenly light goddess was already being intercepted by the soul extinction sea. Which direction was she going to escape to next? The heavenly sea god was pondering. However, what he didn't expect was that the heavenly light goddess didn't evade. Instead, she charged directly toward the soul extinction sea. The purple gold beam of light was like a sharp sword that pierced viciously into the ocean. How is this possible? The heavenly sea god was astonished. This was the ocean that he had summoned when he was in his true Tao form. Yet the heavenly light goddess charged into it just like that. Did she have a death wish? However, in the next instant, the heavenly sea god felt the penetrative power of that purple gold beam of light. This was no ordinary penetrative power. Instead, it truly possessed the power to pierce through two worlds. The soul extinction sea even began to distort and rot from the piercing of that beam of light. Not good. If things continued like this, the heavenly light goddess was going to break through his siege. I'll kill you. The heavenly sea god roared with indignation. The heavenly light goddess had already forced him to use all of his trump cards. The heavenly sea god was utterly humiliated. If he didn't even have the ability to force the heavenly light goddess to stay, wouldn't that mean that his true Tao form would be wasted here? No, he definitely couldn't allow that to happen. The heavenly sea god controlled the ocean to form countless barriers in front of the heavenly light goddess. You have the ability to pierce through one of my oceans, but can you pierce through all of my oceans? His voice had only just fallen when an explosion erupted from the soul extinction sea. The purple gold beam of light had already mercilessly pierced through the boundless ocean. The heavenly heaven god unleashed a spell technique to intercept the heavenly light goddess again. The heavenly light goddess evaded once again. She didn't even have a chance to touch a speck of her light. The heavenly heaven god had no choice but to unleash a full-screen control to seal off all of the space around her. However, full-screen control meant that his power wasn't concentrated. The heavenly light goddess pierced through the barrier and tore through the heavenly heaven god's control. Then, she continued to flee and plunged into the heavenly sea god's ocean vortex. The heavenly sea god was under immense pressure. He was infuriated by the heavenly heaven god's incompetent performance. More importantly, he felt that the heavenly light goddess had already exceeded his control. Regardless of whether it was her speed or penetrative abilities, they were both too terrifying. Just as he was thinking this, another ocean was pierced through by the heavenly light goddess. The heavenly sea god continued to control the terrifyingly powerful ocean with great difficulty and obstructed the heavenly light goddess escape route. Finally, the heavenly light goddess was trapped in a perilous situation. However, the heavenly light goddess didn't give up. Instead, she continued to charge through the barrier. The heavenly sea god's face turned green upon seeing this. He wasn't as relaxed as he appeared. Although he could control a large amount of ocean, he was afraid that the heavenly light goddess would be able to escape before her energy was completely depleted if things continued like this. Chapter 21:72. Just as he was pondering this, the heavenly light goddess pierced through another ocean. The purple golden beam of light flew at a speed that the heavenly heaven god was unable to keep up with. After passing through one of the oceans, it crashed into the second ocean that the heavenly sea god had prepared for her. The heavenly sea god felt as if his own power had been shaken by this collision, and his legs had become a little weak. However, he still continued to chase after the heavenly light goddess. He had to do everything possible to stop the heavenly light goddess. No, he couldn't continue like this. Right at this moment, the purple golden beam of light pierced through the ocean again. The heavenly sea god had no idea how to stop it, and it seemed to be provoking him. The heavenly sea god gritted his teeth in rage. This heavenly light goddess was a freak. Why was she able to unleash such terrifying speed without using her true Tao manifestation? Why? If things continued like this, she might really be able to escape from the ocean. No, I can't waste my true Tao manifestation here. Heavenly heaven. The heavenly sea god's chest rose and fell with rage at the sight of the bewildered heavenly heaven god. You're so useless. The heavenly heaven god faltered initially before a resigned expression appeared on its face. What can I do? She's overexerting the power of the heavenly gods, and I can't keep up with her at all. Furthermore, the light of two realms is like paper to me. Tell me, what else can I do? The heavenly heaven god couldn't think of anything. This heavenly light goddess was like a bug in the game. Even without using her true Tao manifestation, her combat prowess was already far superior to that of the other paramount heavenly gods. No wonder the heavenly light goddess dared to challenge the two of them at once. I have a very good way to make you useful, the heavenly sea god suddenly said. What is it? The heavenly heaven god asked. You can help me if you use your true Tao manifestation now, right? The heavenly sea god replied. The heavenly heaven god. The true Tao manifestation was the most powerful trump card of the paramount heavenly gods. It was a top-notch buff technique that could only be used once in a paramount heavenly god's life. However, the heavenly sea god was asking him to use it so casually. Had it gone insane? Or was the heavenly sea god going insane? Trust me, the two of us will definitely be able to kill the heavenly light goddess, the heavenly sea god said in an excited voice. The heavenly heaven god hesitated momentarily before gritting its teeth and saying, But I have my own plans. I can't waste my true form here. The heavenly sea god was enraged upon hearing this. What do you mean waste? Forcing out the heavenly light god's Tao origin form was what it meant to make the best use of it. If you can't bear to use your true Tao form, then if the heavenly light goddess manages to escape, then my true Tao form will be wasted. This is the best opportunity to force the heavenly light goddess to use her trump card. Heavenly heaven god, please use your Tao form immediately. The heavenly sea god yelled. The heavenly heaven god felt like this was an absurd world. The true manifestation of Tao was clearly the paramount heavenly god's final trump card. It was a life-saving trump card, and he was still very safe, but his allies were advising him to use this trump card. More importantly, he couldn't find any reason to refute. The heavenly sea god's words seemed to make some sense. The heavenly light goddess combat prowess was simply too terrifying. If she were to unleash her true Tao form after completing her transformation, just how powerful would she be? Seizing this opportunity to use the heavenly sea god's Tao form to force out the heavenly sea god's trump card was indeed a very good idea. However, he clearly had his own plans. Furthermore, the true manifestation of Tao could only be combined with the three-phase true heavenly reincarnation formation to unleash an invincible, earth-shattering effect. Now that the heavenly sea god's true manifestation of Tao was missing, the formation's effect would be significantly weaker. In other words, if he forced out the heavenly sea god's trump card, then his own trump card would also be weakened. The heavenly heaven god was caught in a dilemma. This was an extremely difficult decision to make. At this moment, the purple golden light of two realms pierced through the heavenly sea god's ocean barrier again before continuing to flee into the distance. The heavenly sea god tried his best to control the surrounding ocean barrier to intercept it. However, the distance between them was still being widened. "Hurry up! I can't hold on any longer," the heavenly sea god yelled. The heavenly heaven god could see that the streak of light was extremely fast, and it was not something that could be stopped by normal beings. He was clearly the ruler of the entire sky, but he was unable to keep up with his opponent's speed. It was too fast, too powerful, too powerful. However, the heavenly sea god was indeed very powerful. Wasn't he able to keep up with the light goddess? Furthermore, he was able to keep up with the light goddess. Most importantly, there was no way the light goddess could match up to the heavenly sea god in terms of unleashing the power of the paramount heavenly gods. It was still possible that the light goddess would be completely exhausted in the next second, thereby allowing the heavenly sea god to secure the final victory. Perhaps he could secure the final victory without using his true Tao form? That's right, this was entirely possible. The heavenly heaven god felt like he had found the crux of the matter. Right at this moment, an unimaginable pain suddenly erupted in his head. A gargantuan golden trident suddenly punctured his head. An extremely terrifying and pure power of the ocean exploded violently, as if a boundless tsunami were destroying everything in its path, striking the heavenly sea god with an extreme sense of horror. Ah! The heavenly heaven god let loose a blood-curdling cry. A cold, boundless voice sounded from behind him. "F***CK, why are you hesitating? Let me make the decision for you." A gigantic god constructed from a peculiar liquid held a golden trident in his hand as he glowered at the heavenly heaven god with a resentful expression. "Heavenly sea god, you dare." The heavenly heaven god was dumbstruck, and his mind was completely blank. Never would he have thought that the heavenly sea god would stab his head with this weapon that he had never used. What kind of ally was this? His scalp had gone numb. "Don't blame me. I'm making the decision for you," the heavenly sea god said with a pained expression. "You're about to die. If you don't release your true Tao form, you won't be able to survive. Do you know what to do now? For the sake of our great cause, transform." The heavenly sea god spoke with a meaningful expression. Boom! The ocean was parted. The purplish golden beam of light broke through another layer of ocean. She was just about to flee into the distance when she discovered the heavenly sea god stabbing his golden trident into the heavenly heaven god's head, and her entire body shuddered involuntarily. She wasn't intimidated by the heavenly sea god's true Tao form, but she was completely petrified by this. The heavenly sea god wasn't chasing after her, but he was killing an ally instead. What the F***CK was going on? Chapter 2173. This was the first time that the heavenly light goddess felt like she was in a daze. For a split second, she even wondered if the heavenly sea god was a teammate hiding in the enemy camp, waiting to deal a lethal blow to the enemy at the most critical moment. But she quickly rejected this idea. The heavenly heaven god's blood-curdling cries were still reverberating through the air. But all of a sudden, it stopped. This was because its head had completely exploded into a cloud of mist and dissipated in the air. A sense of dread suddenly welled up in the heavenly light goddess' heart. The sky within a radius of 1,000,000 miles had changed. Following that, an incomparably huge figure began to appear in the sky. Its entire body was pure white, and it had the appearance of a human. Its body floated flat in the sky, its arms and legs stretched out as if it was lying on the ground. Just its head alone was hundreds of thousands of miles in size, enough to cover the entire sky. The entire world seemed to be under the control of such a being. The space was so viscous that it caused all living things to come to a standstill, and the atmosphere was so oppressive that all living beings found it hard to breathe. The heavenly human tribe cultivators, who had just escaped from the White Nectar Sea, were in a dire situation. They had thought that they would be safe after leaving the White Nectar Sea. However, before they could even heave a sigh of relief, they discovered a gargantuan humanoid figure sprawled over their heads. The heavenly heaven god was clearly just unleashing its aura, but it was able to make their bodies tremble uncontrollably. This was the involuntary trembling and submission of low-level life forms in the face of a mighty being. Ocean, look at what you did. A furious voice exploded out in the sky, causing a huge gale to kick up for millions of kilometers. The heavenly heaven god's wrath was enough to make the entire realm tremble. A gratified smile appeared on the heavenly sea god's face when he saw the heavenly heaven god's expression. Then, a sorrowful and solemn expression appeared on his face. I'm doing this for the sake of victory. I'm doing this to dispel the misgivings in your heart. If you have any grievances, you can vent them on me. Now, let's deal with the heavenly light God together, okay? Don't waste this origin of Tao. The heavenly heaven god's gargantuan head was filled with rage, but it knew the severity of the situation. Thus, it turned its gaze toward the purple golden light of two realms down below, and just a single glance was enough to fortify the space within a radius of over 5,000 kilometers by 10,000 times. Even a god of creation would be completely immobilized in that place. This is the true form of the heavenly heaven god. The heavenly light goddess was imprisoned, and she looked up at the sky. She felt as if her horizons had been broadened. It was really big. His body occupied the entire sky. Not only was its body huge, but the aura it gave off was also extremely terrifying. Just looking at it made her feel as if she had nowhere to hide. She wasn't the only one who was shocked. Even the Tong Divine City's heaven-crushing army was stunned. In this world, there was actually someone who could do this? Its gargantuan body had traveled countless kilometers from the White Nectar Sea to Tong Divine City. What if the Tong Divine City were to be annihilated with a single kick? All of the return to Void Stage mighty figures who felt like they were already among the most powerful beings in the world were shocked speechless at the sight of the humanoid figure in the sky. The more they experienced, the more they realized how insignificant they were. In the face of a battle of this level, they were probably not even cannon fodder, right? Su Xiaolan's expression changed again and again. The heavenly heaven god's Tao, true manifestation. Are you kidding me? Two paramount heavenly gods have already unleashed their Tao, true manifestations, in just one battle. If things continue like this, will the heavenly light goddess be forced to unleash her Tao, true manifestation, as well? If it weren't for the fact that this is a battle between two paramount heavenly gods, I would have thought that this was the final battle. Her body trembled lightly, and the vermilion bird and true dragon bloodlines within her body began to churn for some reason, as if they were yearning for battle and a breakthrough. Battling normal heavenly gods wouldn't be able to provide her with much enlightenment, but battling a paramount heavenly god would definitely be able to significantly enhance her Tao. However, she still forcibly repressed this urge. In her current state, facing a paramount heavenly god in his true Tao form was no different from courting death. She had to wait for the outcome of the battle to become clear. The final battle doesn't have to wait for everyone to attack. If there's an opportunity, perhaps tonight can be the final battle. Su Xiaolan knew what this night represented. This was an extremely crucial opportunity for the heaven-crushing army. Sigh. If only Enlin was here. The outside world is already in a state of chaos. Enlin, how are things going on your side? She turned to look at the White Nectar Sea, which had been blasted beyond recognition, and murmured. Within the living world, the flower goddess unleashed her most powerful spell technique, the Heaven Hell Flower, and bit down on Enlin. Less than 10 seconds later, the Hell Flower, which was imbued with the power of the entire world, was pulverized by a series of sword projections. Enlin charged out. A black light flashed, and he appeared before the flower goddess before gently tapping a finger on her forehead. Finger of the heavenly Tao. The darkness divine Tao and heaven-crushing techniques were perfectly combined. Boundless golden light erupted from his fingertip, and at the same time, a golden shockwave that was capable of engulfing and annihilating everything transformed into a golden shockwave that punctured the flower goddess body. Wonder God had just pulled out the poison arrow and was about to abandon Enlin to fight the life goddess when his body shuddered involuntarily upon seeing this brutal scene. Enlin immediately unleashed a fist of the heavenly Tao toward Wonder God without any hesitation. Wonder God's body exploded on the spot. Why didn't Enlin try to stall Wonder God and the flower goddess? That was because he could sense that the members of the God of Destruction team were facing an extremely terrifying crisis. The life goddess was no longer weak. The members of the God of Destruction team were no match for her. They would all be wiped out. Enlin couldn't afford to keep this up. All those who stand in my way shall die. He roared with rage as he unleashed his divine simulation technique to locate the life goddess. He then flew into the distance without any hesitation. At this moment, the flower goddess used the power of heaven and earth to revive herself. Ha ha! I'm in your way. Come and kill me. I'm not afraid of death. The flower goddess unleashed a large number of flower vines toward the flying Enlin. She was indeed not afraid of death. Enlin could kill her, but she could revive an unlimited number of times. As expected, Enlin's speed was not as fast as the flower goddess. After all, this was her world, her home field. Even though this world couldn't directly kill Enlin, she still had 100 ways to deal with Enlin. Enlin used his sword to slice through the flower vines. At this moment, the flower goddess had already charged in front of him with a mocking smile. Come and kill me. Enlin took a deep breath as a dark light flashed through his eyes. All right, I'll fulfill your wish. Chapter 2174. The complete divine Tao of darkness flowed out from Enlin's heart and the chaotic black vortex behind him. It was the purest darkness, a darkness that could turn everything into eternal darkness. When the flower goddess saw the darkness in front of her, she immediately felt a sense of fear. It was an instinctive fear and had nothing to do with subjective fear. She would never feel fear because she firmly believed that as long as she was in a living world, she was the symbol of invincibility. Even if Enlin killed her 10,000 times, she would still be able to jump out to harass and mock Enlin. Enlin raised the evil-slaying sword in his hand. A blinding golden light pierced through the sky. It contained a supreme, heaven-crushing true intent. Do you know, I've discovered a phenomenon. That is, the heaven-crushing spell techniques are especially useful in a living world. How useful are they? They're so useful that every time I use a heaven-crushing spell technique, I feel like I can completely destroy the world in front of me. Enlin looked at the flower goddess, whose eyes gradually became filled with fear. A layer of extremely pure darkness appeared on the evil-slaying sword's golden light. Its power continued to increase by several levels, causing the flower goddess' heart to jump for no reason. Die. Wonder God suddenly appeared behind Enlin. His feet were like two sharp heavenly blades, slashing toward Enlin's neck. The space around him was split in half, and a small part of Enlin's protective darkness was torn apart. Enlin's blade turned, and a golden sword projection surged. It was as if something had swept through the void, and a bloody line appeared from Wonder God's head to his feet. Then, his body split into two halves in the process of flying, splitting into two halves without any hindrance or pause. This was only a wisp of sword intent from the golden sword projection. What were you doing? The flower goddess' expression changed drastically. What am I doing? I'm fulfilling your wish to die. Enlin gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and stared coldly at the flower goddess as if he was looking at a dead person. Of course, the death I'm talking about might not be the same as what you're thinking. The darkness silenced all living things, and the golden light made the sky tremble. Darkness sword of the heavenly Tao. Enlin suddenly slashed with his sword. Boom! The golden sword chi exploded in this world, violently tearing apart everything. Forests, oceans, mountains, plains, space, the heavens, and even the laws of heaven and earth were rapidly torn apart by this sword. At this moment, everything was heading towards destruction. No! Flower God's eyes widened as she watched the terrifying sword energy destroy everything. Her body couldn't stop trembling. She knew that this slash wasn't aimed at her, but at the entire world. Countless living beings met their end under this sword. Countless substances were reduced to nothingness by this sword. The laws began to shatter. In the heaven-crushing sect, there was a rule. That was if one could successfully crush the heavens in the simulated small world, they could become a candidate for heavenly disciple. Therefore, every son of heaven candidate had limitless potential. They were all big shots who had once broken through the heavens. However, they had only destroyed a small world. To destroy a large world, the difficulty level was completely different. The living world, created by the goddess of life, could be said to be second only to the Taichu continent. To destroy such a large world, even a true heavenly disciple would find it hard to do so without sufficient preparation. And now, Enlin was going to make the impossible possible. In order to fulfill the flower god's wish of killing her, Enlin was going all out. He decided to do something that others wouldn't even dare to think of. Crush the heavens. That's right. He was going to use absolute power to destroy the heavenly Tao of this world. The flower god had the power to create a world and could revive infinitely. Then, Enlin was going to use what she relied on. If he destroyed this world, then wouldn't the flower god's support be gone? Wouldn't that mean that she couldn't revive? For example, if you wanted to make a company's employee lose his job, but that employee's backer was the company's chairman, he couldn't be killed no matter what. What could you do? It was very simple. Make the company bankrupt. This was the simplest and clearest method. It was suitable for peerless, powerful people. No. For the first time, the flower god was struck by boundless fear, and her entire body trembled. She frantically tried to use her power of creation to stop all of this, to stop this destructive power. However, once this power exceeded a certain limit, even she would be powerless. The darkness sword of the heavenly Tao before her was the most powerful technique that Enlin had unleashed after perfectly fusing his darkness and heaven-crushing techniques. The power that it unleashed in that instant was enough to send chills down the spines of even the paramount heavenly gods, let alone the flower god. It was quite clear that this sword had completely broken free from the flower god's control. The immortal realm that was filled with life and miracles had been transformed into an inky darkness. The darkness was engulfing everything in this world, regardless of whether it was tangible matter or intangible space and energy. The golden light tore through the sky like a supreme golden dragon skimming over the top of the world, slashing apart the laws hidden in the world and then destroying them. The heavens mourned, and all things trembled in fear. A series of thin black lines appeared on the surface of the evil-slaying sword before spreading toward heaven and earth. These thin lines didn't look like much at first glance. However, if a powerful being were to look at them, they would definitely be astonished. This was because the black lines within the sword were actually a series of Tao that led directly to the essence of everything. They represented the ultimate pursuit of everything. How many of these black lines were there? There were countless of them. They formed special veined patterns that spread outward, piercing into the void of this world like black swords. Immediately afterward, the world began to tremor violently. This tremor was several times more violent than when Enlin unleashed his darkness, sword of the heavenly Tao. The flower god hadn't been struck by Enlin's attack, but she was struck by an indescribable backlash. She threw up blood relentlessly, and the flowers and vines on her body began to quickly wither. The recently resurrected Qi Shun still had an arm that hadn't recovered, and it completely stopped regenerating. They were all terrified as their minds went blank at the sight of everything being destroyed. He's not destroying everything on the surface of this world. He's even destroying the great Tao of heaven and earth of this world. The essence of the heavenly Tao has been severely wounded. The two gods were both astonished. Everything that was happening before their eyes was truly earth-shattering, and they couldn't do anything. And Lin, I've already captured all of the heavenly Tao of this world. Should I destroy them all? A cold and tender voice sounded. This was none other than little Xie. And Lin looked at the shattered world before him. Destroy. Chapter 2175. Everything in this world had been created by the life goddess. There were a vast number of peculiar and terrifying living beings living here, and if they were to be released into the Tai Chu continent, they would definitely be an unimaginable disaster. Of course, there were also some extremely adorable living beings here that satisfied the life goddess interest. No matter what kind of living being they were, they could only be destroyed in the face of the golden sword projection and the boundless darkness that split the earth and space. The power of destruction had already spread throughout the entire world. The heavenly life goddess was having a showdown with the battling Buddha, demon Lord Ling Gu, and the other members of the Gods of Destruction team. The battling Buddha's golden-banded staff had been destroyed, and one of his arms had already been severed. Michael had been killed 3 times, and his holy light, indestructible body was on the brink of collapse. Yun Minjing's wings had been plucked off, and Demon Lord Ling Gu had been pummeled into a salted egg. If it weren't for the fact that Demon Emperor Yu had forcibly consumed divine wine and unleashed his god of creation stage power, all of these members would have most likely been killed already. However, that didn't mean that he could defeat the heavenly life goddess. All he could do was delay their annihilation. Boom! A crimson saber of death tore a gaping wound into Demon Emperor Yu's chest, instantly draining all of his blood, and his life force was quickly being stripped away. The life goddess stood in the air with a cold expression on her face. Accept your deaths. You don't deserve to live. The life goddess raised her saber of death high into the air. Right at this moment, a peerlessly sharp golden light imbued with the paramount Sword Tao true intent and absolute Tao intent that could slice through heaven and earth hurtled through the air from afar, upon which the heavens were shattered, and the earth was shattered as darkness engulfed everything. Life, matter, energy, space, laws, and even the Tao of heaven and earth all began to descend toward destruction at this moment. Everything happened so suddenly, and it struck fear into everyone's hearts. The world had been destroyed. The life goddess body shuddered, as if she had been immobilized by something. She looked on with incredulity etched on her face. How could this be? This is a world that I created. How could it disappear just like that? Not only is there heaven-crushing power, but there's also the power of darkness. And Lin, it's you again. It's in Lin again. The life goddess suddenly let loose an enraged roar as boundless life force erupted forth, spreading for hundreds of kilometers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kilometers. This power seemed to be trying to mend this world. However, it was all too late. Not only had the matter of life been destroyed, even the laws of the world and the heavenly Tao had been severely damaged and were heading towards destruction. The goddess of life's efforts were of no help at all. If she were a god of creation, she would have been able to detect the anomaly immediately and carry out a comprehensive rescue. But the problem was that the authority had been given to the 2 protectors. You want to take back the authority? Not only would they not be able to save this world, but they would also suffer a backlash from the destruction of this world. Only a fool would do such a thing. Hence, even the heavenly life god, the creator of this world, could only look on as everything before her eyes fell toward destruction. Why is it like this? I've spent so much effort to create this world, and Lin, why do you always make life difficult for me? The life goddess looked at the world that was being destroyed in front of her, and her orange eyes were filled with tears. Indignation and helplessness filled her entire body, making her doubt herself and doubt reality. Why was it that all of her precious possessions were being completely destroyed by Lin? Regardless of whether it was the immortal universe, the world tree, the 3 true heavenly reincarnation formation, or the living world, none of them could escape from Lin. The members of the Gods of Destruction team were also dumbstruck. Their team leader was simply too bad *SS. They had thought that foiling the plans of the three paramount heavenly gods would already be a huge boon for them. But who would have thought that they would also be destroying the world created by the goddess of life? The goddess of life was being bullied to the point of tears by team leader Enlin. How powerful did one have to be to make a paramount heavenly god cry? In the past, they wouldn't even dare to imagine something like this. Even though they were witnessing it with their own eyes, they still felt like they were dreaming. Of course, Michael, Demon Lord Lingu, and the others didn't dare to say anything. If they were to provoke the goddess of life now, they would be using their own lives to mock the enemy. They were simply complaining that they had lived for too long. Big Brother Enlin is so bad *SS. He has demonstrated to us what it means to crush the heavens. The battling Buddha praised with excitement. Big Brother Enlin? You should be calling him Heavenly Disciple. Yun Minjing blushed as she clasped her hands over her delicate cheeks and looked into the darkness in the distance. Heavenly Disciple like this is so mesmerizing. I feel that my broken little world in the past is like playing house compared to this. Michael sighed with emotion. This is far too powerful and unimaginable. To think that such a high-level world could be destroyed using heaven-crushing techniques. My heaven-crushing techniques will definitely be able to elevate my heaven-crushing techniques to a whole new level. The heaven-crushing sect Heavenly Disciple candidates were all extremely proud and powerful beings. However, in the face of Enlin, all they could do was express heartfelt admiration and reverence. They couldn't help but be impressed by such a bad *SS character. At this moment, Demon Emperor Cu took advantage of the goddess of life's dazed state to transmit his voice to the members of the Gods of Destruction team. Let's use the Void Body mantra right now and leave this world. This world is about to collapse. The Void Body mantra could conceal itself from the senses of heavenly gods to the greatest extent. It was unrealistic to play hide-and-seek in front of the goddess of life. However, the goddess of life's attention was completely drawn to the destruction of this world. This was a completely different matter. All of them used the Void Body illusion technique to erase their presence as much as possible before fleeing toward the exit of this living world. They knew that they had already completed their most important mission. If they continued to stay in this world, they would instead become a burden to Enlin. As such, it was better to escape this world first. They fled. The goddess of life didn't chase after them. At this moment, at the center of the world's destruction, this place had already transformed into a vast expanse of darkness. This was the most primordial darkness. There was nothing, and nothing existed. It was as if this were the origin of everything, the end of all eternity. And Lin stood at the center of this darkness. He existed, and he perfectly blended in with the non-existence around him. It was as if he were the king who ruled over everything. This world is completely finished. Heaven-crushing progress, 99%. There's still the last 1%. Didn't you tell me to kill you? And Lin turned to look at the trembling flower goddess with a grin. Didn't you tell me to kill you? Now, I'm going to kill you. Chapter 2176. The flower goddess was scared out of her wits when she heard Lin's words. She had thought that she was invincible and that as long as she was in this world, she would never die and that she could mock and provoke Lin to her heart's content. But now, she finally realized what a foolish mistake she had made, and Lin could kill her, and he had the ability to kill her forever. Furthermore, he had already raised the sword in his hand, and the fear of death had engulfed her entire body. She didn't even have the courage to beg for mercy. No, no. Farewell, flower goddess who won't die. And Lin spoke indifferently, and the evil-slaying sword descended. A black line appeared on the flower goddess' body. The black line then expanded and completely engulfed her body. Her aura and her existence also completely disappeared from this world. And Lin then turned his gaze toward the Wonder God. The Wonder God had a backbone, and he pounced toward Lin as if he had gone berserk, intending to fight to the death. However, before he could even get close to Lin, the final power of heaven and earth had already acted upon his body, causing his entire body to swell and the energy within his body to go berserk. He howled hysterically in pain. And Lin knew that this was the backlash from the destruction of the world to the god of creation. Originally, this backlash was born by the goddess of life, but due to the transfer of the authority of the god of creation, the backlash was now born by the wonder god. And Lin seemed to have understood something in that instant. Could it be that the goddess of life already had this plan in mind when she created the two guardians? Or perhaps she already had a way to deal with this extreme situation. Otherwise, how could the two guardians be so compatible with this world before the wonder god could even get close to him? He was completely annihilated. The destruction of the world, the death of the god of creation. Everything was over, and Lin could even hear the sound of the heavenly Tao collapsing. Everything in the world turned into nothingness, and Lin looked around to discover that everything had been transformed into darkness and chaos. There was no space, no direction, nothing. However, this nothingness could destroy everything that existed, turning everything that existed into something that didn't exist. Everything turned into nothingness. Eternal darkness. This was the truest Tao, and Lin sighed softly, but no one knew what he was sighing about. Little Xie, I gave you a great world to train in. Have you comprehended anything yet? The evil slaying sword in his hand shuddered slightly and let out a clear ringing, indicating that it was in the process of attaining enlightenment. After that, it fell silent again. It was quite clear that little Xie had benefited greatly from this trip. No one would dare to think of giving little Xie an entire great world to practice her heaven-crushing technique on. Even gods of creation didn't have the guts to do something like that. After all, doing something like that could cost someone their life. To be honest, if this world wasn't the goddess of life's world, and Lin wouldn't have dared to do that. It just so happened that the life goddess was busy refining the immeasurable flower and couldn't spare any energy to use the power of creation. It just so happened that the living world was at its weakest, and there were only two rookies acting as the creator gods. And Lin would not break the heavens. I'm sorry for this series of coincidences. However, he could not help but sigh in the end. All of the living beings in the living world had been created by the goddess of life, and they were part of the enemy's army. However, Enlin had destroyed them all at once. As a human, Enlin always felt guilty. His power was darkness, so he should have been excited to destroy a world and turn it into nothingness. However, he existed more as a living being, and living beings always had a sense of reverence and pity toward other living beings. This was a trait that he was unable to erase. This was a very conflicted feeling, but Enlin didn't feel like he was abnormal. So be it. There aren't that many ideal battles in this world anyway. In order to achieve victory, I have to learn to make some cruel choices, and Lin shook his head before flying toward the point where the two worlds were connected. He could sense that the Gods of Destruction team had already left this place, so it was time for him to return. Amid the chaos and darkness, there was still a gate between the two worlds that was glowing with a faint light. And Lin made his way toward the gate, only to see the figure of a woman beside the gate. The woman was dressed in a light green floral dress, and her figure was graceful and unparalleled. She had a beautiful face that seemed to be able to dispel all gloominess, and her orange-red eyes were shining brightly. She looked at Enlin in silence. Enlin wanted to pretend that he didn't see her and directly step into the gate between the two worlds. Then, the woman took a step forward and blocked his way. She stared at the man in front of her and said word by word, "You blew up my home, and you want to leave just like that without saying a word? Then what do you want? Could it be that you want to seek revenge? Do you not want to live anymore?" And Lin asked in a calm and collected manner, "You can't kill me. You should know this from the moment you entered the living world." The woman's voice was still calm, and Lin looked at the unbelievably beautiful woman in front of him. Her eyes were still a little red, and it was clear that she had just been crying. And Lin felt like the goddess of life was quite pitiful, and he could only take advantage of the fact that he couldn't kill her. He didn't deny the goddess of life's words. "Your life force is indeed a little strange. I can't do anything to you for now, but you can't kill me either. I'm not trying to kill you by force." A smile appeared on the goddess of life's face. It's just that I have something I want to talk to you about. The members of the god-slaying team escaped from the living world. They were still unable to contain their excitement as they traveled along the passageway between the two worlds. We've done something earth-shattering. Demon Lord Lingu was extremely excited. That's right. We've successfully foiled the scheme of the three paramount heavenly gods and destroyed the heavenly life god's world, thereby eliminating a major threat to the Tai-Chu continent. Yin Minjing was also in a very good mood. She had finally realized her value. It's very likely that the monsters in the living world were created by the heavenly life god in order to cleanse the entire continent after destroying the human race. We've done a huge favor by destroying them in advance. Demon Emperor Siyu gulped down another mouthful of wine with elation. I wonder how Big Brother Enlin is doing. He's going to have to face the wrath of the heavenly life god. The battling Buddha was a little concerned. Let's trust in Enlin. He'll definitely be safe with his powerful combat prowess. The living world is too dangerous, so we should get out of here as soon as possible, Michael said. Everyone nodded upon hearing this. The battle in the living world had already come to an end, so they wouldn't be of much help for now. As opposed to staying there and making Enlin worry and protect them, it was better for them to get out of here so that Enlin wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. Soon, they made it out of the passageway between the two worlds. They thought that they had finally escaped from danger. However, never would they have thought that an even more terrifying existence would be in the White Nectar Sea. Chapter 2177. Even the weakest member of the God of Destruction team was at the Tao Integration Pinnacle stage. However, when they appeared at the bottom of the White Jade Sea, they were struck by an extremely powerful sense of fear, as if their bodies had been enveloped by an extremely terrifying power. They knew that this power wasn't targeting them, but the invisible pressure emanating from it made them even more afraid to breathe. What kind of scene was this? The White Jade Sea had been blasted into smithereens by the power of light, and the seabed had been completely deformed. Chaotic turbulence and laws of destruction could be seen everywhere. Above the sea, violent storms roared, lightning flashed, and waterspouts covered heaven and earth. There were also countless peculiar seas that revolved like galaxies, exuding extremely terrifying oceanic might. Elsewhere in the sky, there was a holy power of light surging, transforming heaven and earth from night into day and purifying everything it shone upon. At the top of the heavens, there was an unimaginable giant that obscured the entire sky. It spread open its arms, as if it were trying to embrace the entire world. The heavenly light goddess, the heavenly sea god, the heavenly heaven god, all three paramount heavenly gods were here. However, Michael's legs began to tremble. All three paramount heavenly gods are here. This welcome is way too grand. Michael, who was struggling to even fight the heavenly temperature god, was feeling extremely nervous and desperate now. He really couldn't handle such a terrifying scene. Not only him, but all of the other members present were also struggling. Just getting close to the three paramount heavenly gods was already making them tremble in fear. How could they muster up the courage to fight against them? Calm down, they're not targeting us. Demon Emperor Siyu was the first to calm down. Only then did everyone come to their senses. That's right, all sorts of terrifying powers were clashing, and they really weren't targeting them. They had all been scared **Class by the overwhelming auras, but now that they had calmed down, they discovered that the three paramount heavenly gods were engaged in an internal battle. They were even more dumbstruck now. What the **CK were the three paramount heavenly gods fighting? The human race hadn't even been eradicated yet, and they were already fighting? And their brains were being beaten out of their bodies? What kind of vendetta was this? It was not an exaggeration to say that their brains were being beaten out of their bodies. At this moment, the heavenly sea god and the heavenly heaven god's auras had become unimaginably powerful, and they had also entered some kind of paramount state. And Lin had once told them that this was the true form of a heavenly god. It was the ultimate trump card of a supreme heavenly god. They had been very worried about what they would do if the paramount Empyrean gods were to unleash their true Tao forms at the same time. However, the paramount heavenly gods weren't using their true Tao manifestation against the heaven-crushing united army. Instead, they were using their true Tao manifestation against the heavenly light goddess, who was also a heavenly god. It was too dreamy. What the hell happened? The members of the God of Destruction team were both shocked and overjoyed. It was hard to describe their complicated emotions at the moment. It was like playing a game of Fight the Landlord. The landlord didn't have many cards in his hand and looked like he was going to lose. In the end, two farmers suddenly got into a fight and even threw ace bombs at each other. The key was that the ace bombs didn't double. It was purely a waste of trump cards. What kind of experience was that? It was really hard to describe. However, they knew that perhaps they could properly thank the heavenly light goddess. The heavenly light goddess definitely had something to do with everything that was happening right now. If they knew that the heavenly light goddess had just saved them from being attacked by the two paramount heavenly gods, their emotions would definitely become even more complicated. They might even shed tears of gratitude. The heavenly light goddess is truly powerful. To think that she was able to force out the true forms of the two paramount heavenly gods. Yin Minjing's sensory abilities were extremely powerful. Thus, she was able to sense just how thrilling everything that was happening before her eyes was. However, it looks like the heavenly light goddess won't be able to hold on much longer either. It's very likely that she's going to unleash her true Tao manifestation. The battling Buddha observed the battle with his golden fiery eyes. Haha, isn't that even better? Our enemies have one less trump card now. Demon Lord Ling Gu was very elated. Fight! Fight! Let's kill each other. Right at this moment, the massive white humanoid figure in the sky suddenly extended a palm toward the heavenly light goddess, upon which boundless power of space poured down upon the heavenly light goddess. The heavenly light goddess expression shifted slightly, and her body flashed through the air. However, her movements were severely restricted by the space that had been reinforced over 10,000 times, so she was completely unable to evade. Boom! A massive force crashed into the heavenly light goddess. The heavenly light goddess was blasted into the ocean. A massive palm print that spanned over 10,000 kilometers appeared over the white nectar sea, pushing aside all of the seawater and even the rock formations at the bottom of the sea. Michael and the others were situated right at the edge of the palm strike, and they had already unleashed their divine abilities to evade it. However, they were still blasted flying by the power of the palm strike, upon which they sustained various injuries. We can't stay here any longer. We have to get out of here. Demon Emperor Cu spoke in an urgent voice. There were risks involved in spectating this battle. If they were unlucky, even powerful beings like them could perish on the spot. Even without his reminder, the other members of the heavenly light goddess sect knew what to do. Thus, they didn't say anything and immediately fled into the distance. However, things were still progressing from bad to worse. After unleashing its true Tao manifestation, the heavenly heaven god's sensory abilities were extremely fearsome, and he immediately discovered the few people who were quickly fleeing through the ocean. I see a few ants. The heavenly heaven god turned toward the fleeing members of the god-slaying team. In that instant, all of the god-slaying team members felt as if the space around them had become extremely viscous. Their speed of movement plummeted at a rapid rate, as if there was something extremely terrifying above their heads that was causing the space around them to undergo a qualitative change, thereby impeding their movement. Crap, we've been targeted. All of the god-slaying team members felt as if they had been plunged into a glacial pit. They really were being targeted. Furthermore, the heavenly god's gaze alone was enough to render all of their fleeing divine abilities completely ineffective. What was it like to be targeted by a paramount heavenly god who had unleashed his true Tao manifestation? The battling Buddha and the others were finally able to experience this feeling. This was the feeling of having their lives firmly in the hands of their enemy. They had already attained their heaven-crushing true intent and had even broken the sky of a small world, but they were still struck by a deep sense of powerlessness in the face of this boundlessly mighty being. Why are there only a few ants? Where's the heavenly darkness god? Could it be that he's still fighting in an inhabited world? How is the heavenly life god? The heavenly heaven god's voice was imbued with paramount might. Cold sweat poured down the faces of all of the god-slaying team members. There was no way they could respond to this. If they told them that the heavenly life god's world had been destroyed by Lin, would the heavenly heaven god destroy them in a fit of rage? A few seconds later. All right, you'd rather die than divulge this information? The heavenly heaven god's wrath erupted into the heavens. All of the god-slaying team members were on the verge of tears. How is this having a backbone? They really didn't know what to say. At this moment, the heavenly heaven god had already raised his arm, which crashed down viciously toward all of the god-slaying team members. Chapter 2178. The battling Buddha swore that this was the most despairing moment he had ever experienced. As he looked at the oncoming palm, he couldn't help but recall the feeling of being crushed by Buddha Shakyamuni's palm when he was still very weak. That was a sense of despair that had nowhere to run. He had already become very powerful, but when that sense of despair appeared again, he suddenly realized that he still had a long way to go and was nowhere near powerful enough. Infinite intoxication, fist of the heavenly Tao. Demon Emperor Cu unleashed his final retaliation, and a golden fist projection erupted into the sky, as if it were going to destroy the entire world. Dazzling golden light lit up heaven and earth, even taking away some of the light from the palm in the sky. All the other members of the god-slaying team were roused by this punch. Finger of the heavenly Tao. Mi Jia Lai pointed a finger at the sky, and holy light and golden light fused perfectly at that moment, shooting up into the clouds. Fist of the heavenly Tao. The battling Buddha let loose an enraged roar as he also unleashed a fist toward the massive palm in the sky. At the same time, countless divine monkeys materialized to unleash their own fists, making it appear as if there were countless fists of the heavenly Tao hurtling toward the sky. Palm of the heavenly Tao. Demon Lord Ling Gu also unleashed a palm. Reincarnation of the heavenly Tao. Black and white intertwined in Yun Minjing size as she spread open her wings and charged toward the heavenly heaven god's attack. At the same time, she unleashed a yin-yang spell technique that could sever reincarnation, which continued to expand in size in an attempt to take on the palm. All 5 members of the god-slaying team unleashed their most powerful defenses in that instant. One top-notch heaven-crushing technique after another clashed with the massive spatial palm, upon which world-destroying destructive power erupted. Boom! Heaven and earth tremored violently. The massive palm in the sky tremored violently, and countless cracks even began to appear on its surface. The heavenly heaven god's expression shifted slightly. He could feel a tearing sensation erupting from his palm, as well as a power that threatened to tear apart heaven and earth. This power was comprised of 5 different types of powers, and all of them were unleashed at the same time, making it impossible for the heavenly heaven god's palm to descend any further. Demon Emperor Cu and the others didn't dare to waste any more time, and they immediately fled toward Yu Tong City. Interesting. Who would have thought that ants like you would have the will to defy the heavens? The heavenly heaven god chuckled as an even more terrifying power erupted from its palm, and it descended from the sky again. The power of the space world crazily pressed down on the 5 members. How could it allow its enemies to run away after offending its dignity? Anyone who dared to appear in front of it could only die. The palm of the sky descended. Before the palm even arrived, the ocean had already caved in, forming an incomparably huge palm print that stretched for thousands of miles. The seawater roared and the rock layers exploded. The members of the God of Destruction team felt an indescribable force at that moment. They were unable to react in time and were thrown into the ocean. The battling Buddha's immortal divine monkey body was torn apart by the terrifying atmospheric pressure, and blood splattered through the air. Michael was even flattened by the power of space, and he looked like he was about to become flat. Demon Emperor C didn't fare any better either. He used a wine gourd on his back to defend himself, but the surface of the gourd was already covered in cracks and could explode at any moment. Just when everyone was in despair, a purplish golden beam of light suddenly shot out from the seabed and fled into the distance. Its speed was even faster than the speed of light as it pierced through space. "Don't let her get away!" the heavenly sea god roared. "Trying to escape? Dream on." The heavenly heaven god's attention was also drawn to the golden beam of light. It withdrew its power toward the members of the God of Destruction team and focused its power on the purplish golden beam of light. The boundless power of the heavens instantly enshrouded the beam of light, and its speed began to plummet. The members of the God of Destruction team regained their freedom. They were all heavily injured and covered in blood. The sky palm had attacked them from all directions. Even their souls had almost been torn apart by that palm. Having survived the ordeal, they did not say a word and continued to run. The heavenly light goddess wanted to take advantage of the gap between them and the heavenly heaven god and the heavenly light goddess to escape. Of course, they could also take advantage of the gap between them and the heavenly heaven god and the heavenly light goddess to escape. From the looks of it, the heavenly heaven god was clearly more interested in the heavenly light goddess. After seeing the heavenly light goddess trying to escape, the heavenly heaven god completely ignored them. In fact, it didn't even want to waste a single second before unleashing its full power to attack the heavenly light goddess. The heavenly light goddess escape plan was destined to fail. 5 figures fled from the white nectar sea in a sorry state at an extremely fast speed. When their auras completely escaped from the 2 paramount heavenly gods, all of them were struck by the urge to cry. This was a feeling as if they had risen from hell to heaven. We did it. We managed to escape. We were able to escape from the paramount heavenly gods' true forms of Tao. Who would have thought that we would be able to do this? This is all thanks to the assistance of the heavenly light goddess. We're so unlucky. We were dragged into the most powerful battle of our enemies and were almost killed by the heavenly heaven god. Thankfully, we were lucky in the end. The members of the God of Destruction team sighed with emotion as they continued to flee. By the way, it's not bad that we were able to escape, but what about Big Boss and Lin? He's going to come out of the gate of the 2 realms soon, and he's definitely going to face the wrath of the 2 paramount heavenly gods, or even the 4 paramount heavenly gods. Demon Lord Ling Gu suddenly spoke. All of the members drew a sharp intake of breath upon hearing this. No way. After all, the sea and the sky still have to chase after the light. Do you think they'll let someone who killed the paramount heavenly earth god, destroyed countless heavenly gates, and foiled countless plans of the paramount heavenly gods? With how powerful Lin is, they might even temporarily stop fighting and join forces. Everyone became even more perturbed upon hearing this. That was indeed the case. For powerful beings of their caliber, they were already in despair when faced with a paramount heavenly god. Now, Lin was going to have to face 4 paramount heavenly gods? Just the thought of it sent chills running down their spines. Just as the members of the God of Destruction team were worrying about Lin, a series of transparent crystalline barriers transformed into boundless layers that sealed off the purplish golden light. A peculiar spatial tremor erupted from the pinnacle of the heavens, and the woman in the black dress was forced out of the light of 2 realms. Splat! Blood splattered through the air. 3 golden spear-like objects pierced through the woman's body. The light goddess' eyes widened as she stared at her chest, which had been punctured by the golden ocean trident. The golden ocean trident was imbued with the boundless power of the ocean, as if it were a manifestation of tens of thousands of boundless oceans. The heavenly heaven god had been forced to reveal his true form of Tao by this trident, so one could imagine just how terrifying the heavenly sea god's golden trident was. It's over. A smile appeared on the heavenly sea god's face as he looked at the heavenly light goddess, who was riddled with wounds. If you don't use your true form of Tao, you're going to die. Chapter 2179. The heavenly light goddess was impaled by the golden ocean trident. Her body was riddled with wounds, and this was the first time she felt her life slipping away. Light could not escape the pursuit of the sea and the sky. The power of the golden ocean trident was like a vortex in the ocean, threatening to engulf her and merge her with the ocean forever. The heavenly sea god was right. She was going to die. If she didn't release her true Tao, she was really going to die. The heavenly light goddess had miscalculated. She had initially planned to force out the true Tao of a paramount heavenly god before escaping. However, she didn't think that the heavenly sea god would stab the heavenly heaven god in the back. She was now facing two true Tao manifestations. This was simply hell mode. Right at this moment, the spatial gate at the bottom of the ocean began to tremor slightly. A handsome man in a white robe walked out leisurely. However, his leisurely expression suddenly changed in the next second. Holy F***CK. What's going on? He was dumbstruck. He sensed three extremely terrifying auras. The man who had appeared was none other than Enlin. In the instant that Enlin returned to the Taichu continent, his entire body tensed up, and he immediately entered a battle mode, fearing that the three paramount heavenly gods had set up a trap to kill him. However, he soon discovered that he was overthinking things. The heavenly sea god's trident was impaled in the chest of an extremely beautiful woman, so there was no way that they were here to kill him. However, Enlin was even more dumbstruck when he saw the situation before him. The moonlit night monarch. No, it's not her. There's a power that I hate, the power of light. It's the heavenly light goddess. Also, the heavenly sea god and the heavenly heaven god are in very terrifying states, but they're also very familiar. Are these F***king true Tao manifestations? These must be the true Tao manifestations. Enlin was completely astonished. Three paramount heavenly gods were fighting, and two of them had unleashed their true Tao manifestations. This was way too F***king bizarre. Am I trapped in some kind of illusionary realm? The amount of information imbued in front of him gave Enlin a massive shock. But before they had the time to digest it, the three gods had already noticed Enlin's appearance. It couldn't be helped. They were now in a state of combat with full firepower, so they were extremely sensitive to their surroundings. In particular, Sky and Sea had even used their Tao forms. Even if Enlin used darkness to envelop his body, he still wouldn't be able to conceal his aura. It's Enlin. Enlin has come out. The heavenly sea god exclaimed excitedly. Why are you the only one here? What happened to the heavenly life god? The heavenly heaven god seemed to have realized something and flared up with rage. Life is a good girl. She passed away peacefully, Enlin said with a smile. Rumble. In an instant, the terrifying power of the sky crashed down on Enlin. A huge hole was blasted open in the ocean where Enlin was, causing a sky-shaking roar. The boundless power even caused the seabed's rock layer to crack for thousands of kilometers. Enlin was at the center of this power. The black feather robe wrapped around his body, blocking that power. He could sense the limits of the sky, and his expression finally became a bit more serious. It's not a good habit to speak ill of me behind my back. A clear and sweet voice sounded from behind him. Enlin, you ruined my plan and destroyed my world. Are you prepared to pay with your life? The voice was very pleasant, but it was imbued with an extremely cold intent. A woman with a perfect figure walked out from the gate between the two worlds with a deathly light saber in her hand. She immediately slashed the saber toward Enlin. Enlin immediately raised a hand to defend himself. The power of death exploded right before his eyes, creating a massive hole in the seawater around him. This was not due to the clash of powers. Instead, the seawater had been corroded by the power of death and was instantly disintegrated into nothingness. Not only could the power of death unleashed by the heavenly life goddess annihilate life forms, but it could also forcibly annihilate matter. What a violent woman. Enlin's lips curled up into a smile as he gripped the heavenly life goddess' deathly lightsaber with one hand before lashing out with a kick. Boom! Darkness exploded. All of the heavenly life goddess defenses were engulfed by the domineering darkness, and her slender waist was almost deformed from the force of the kick. She let loose a muffled groan as she was sent flying. And Lin unleashed his full power, and he could even completely suppress a paramount heavenly god. Lin, you're dead. The heavenly heaven god was enraged by the sight of the heavenly life goddess being bullied by Enlin. The light goddess yelled in a righteous voice, "Heavenly god, heavenly sea god, you know just how terrifying Enlin is. Not only is he my enemy, but he's also your enemy. With such a powerful enemy, the longer we keep him around, the more trouble we'll have to face in the future. Now is the perfect opportunity to kill him. If you miss this opportunity, it will be very difficult for you to find another one. I, the light goddess, am willing to form a temporary alliance with you to kill Enlin together. We'll settle our scores after we kill Enlin. What do you think?" Enlin drew a sharp intake of breath. The heavenly sea god and the heavenly heaven god's expressions changed drastically. However, they were clearly tempted by the light goddess proposal. The light goddess was indeed a huge threat, but was the heavenly darkness god not a huge threat? They wanted to use the light goddess to deplete the heaven-crushing sex power. Letting the heavenly light goddess off for now and focusing on Enlin didn't seem like a bad idea. Enlin felt like something was amiss. The heavenly light goddess was trying to lure their enemies to him? Did she really think he was a weakling? He immediately spoke in a panicked voice. Heavenly sea god, don't forget who forced you to reveal your true Tao forms. Instead of avenging yourself, you're trying to kill me? Are you going to help the heavenly light goddess count the money after being sold?" His words struck a sore spot for the two paramount heavenly gods. They knew that Enlin was not a bad idea, but if they were to join forces to attack Enlin, they would feel like they were being led around by the nose by the light. "Enlin, I hereby announce that we're officially breaking up. I'm not going to play with you anymore," the light goddess announced. The heavenly heaven god. The heavenly sea god. Enlin was astonished. "What?" The light goddess turned toward the two paramount heavenly gods with an aggrieved expression. "Why do you think I'm here? Why did I appear here tonight? Is this really a coincidence? Enlin entered another world to ruin your plans, but I just so happened to appear here to ruin your plans. Is this all a coincidence?" The heavenly heaven god narrowed its eyes. "Could it be? That's right. I admit that I had a temporary partnership with Enlin, so he was my temporary ally. He was also the one who came up with this plan. Regardless of whether it was to destroy this world or force you to reveal your true Tao forms, it was all part of his plan. He is the true mastermind behind all of this." The holy light goddess glared at Enlin with resentment in her eyes. "I want to take advantage of my battle with you to create an opportunity for everyone to escape from this battlefield, but you pushed all the blame onto me and forced me into a dead end. Didn't we agree to bear the consequences together? If you're heartless, then don't blame me for being heartless." The heavenly sea god glowered at Enlin. You traitor! You traitor!" Enlin. Chapter 2180. Enlin was stunned by the heavenly light goddess's actions. She had forcefully become the heavenly light goddess's ally, and she had even become the main *king planner of this operation. She was a paramount heavenly god, the greatest, brightest, and most righteous heavenly god. Enlin really wanted to ask her if she still wanted the lotus. A thoughtful expression appeared on the heavenly heaven god's face as he nodded. "This is indeed quite a coincidence. If neither Enlin nor the light faction were to come, then this plan would be fraught with peril. However, if both sides were to join forces, then this plan would be flawless. Therefore, what the heavenly light goddess said is most likely true. The heavenly heaven god made his own judgment. But isn't it the best choice for everyone to cooperate and escape?" The life goddess was still a little perplexed. "Unless..." The heavenly sea god stared at Enlin with a profound look in his eyes. Enlin's heart warmed up upon hearing this. The heavenly light goddess was just spouting nonsense. "Brother Sea, it's your turn to perform. Unless the heavenly light goddess wants to use this opportunity to get rid of Enlin. Their cooperation was terminated the moment Enlin appeared. The heavenly light goddess wants to maximize her own benefits. The heavenly sea god speculated with a penetrating gaze. In that case, the heavenly light goddess's words are more believable, the heavenly heaven god said. As expected, Enlin is the one who deserves to die. The life goddess was also furious. Enlin, you've hidden yourself so well. But this is also the heavenly darkness goddess's style. She's cunning and powerful. Enlin was completely dumbfounded. These paramount heavenly gods have all gone crazy. What the F***CK? They're just looking for an excuse to kill me, right? Don't be led astray by the heavenly light goddess. Enlin hurriedly explained. She wants to kill you all. This is the truth, and it's also her intention. I have nothing to do with her. The mastermind would never admit to being the mastermind. Heavenly darkness goddess die. The heavenly heaven god let loose an enraged roar as a blue light descended upon the white nectar sea, creating a boundless spatial power. It was as if the power of the entire heavens were crushing down upon Enlin's body, causing the darkness around him to tremble violently. The divine light goddess shot a cold glance at the heavenly sea god. Now, can you pull out the golden trident from my body? The heavenly sea god was a little embarrassed upon hearing this, and he tried to pull his golden trident back. But halfway through, he stopped. There weren't many opportunities to stab the heavenly light goddess with the oceanic golden trident. The heavenly light goddess was currently very weak, so they could use the power of the ocean within the trident to force out the Tao true form of the divine light goddess. Then, they could force the divine light goddess to join forces with them to deal with Enlin. Wouldn't that be a surefire way to kill two birds with one stone? The heavenly sea god was tempted. He thought the idea was perfect. The heavenly light goddess discovered that the golden trident had stopped moving, and she instantly understood what her opponent was thinking. Great light heavenly god technique, light of feathers. The heavenly light goddess once again unleashed her paramount heavenly god technique, which expended her blood essence. Her body instantly transformed into countless feathers as she forcibly broke free from the heavenly sea god's golden trident and flew into the distance. See, what were you trying to do just then? The heavenly light goddess transformed into an exquisitely beautiful black-haired woman, and her eyes were almost spitting flames. Huh, nothing much. Let's hurry up and deal with Enlin. As long as you don't run, the heavenly sea god and I will not target you. If you dare to run, the heavenly sea god and I will still be alive, and we will target you first. The heavenly sea god pretended not to understand and urged. The heavenly light goddess had never seen such a shameless person. The heavenly sea god sighed in his heart. It was a pity that the heavenly light goddess was too vigilant. She actually used a powerful technique to evade the attack range of his trident. It was going to be troublesome to capture her now. It was better to deal with Enlin first. Heavenly god technique, boundless realm suppression. The heavenly heaven god's gargantuan body, hovering in the air, suddenly folded its arms before crashing down viciously toward Enlin. This was the first time it had used its hands to attack ever since it had revealed its true form. A series of blue crystalline objects descended upon Enlin like an inverted dome, covering an area with no end in sight. Enlin had only just defended against the heavenly heaven god's first spell technique, when a second spell technique came crashing down upon him. This was an all-encompassing spell technique, so there was no way to evade it. Enlin could only unleash a barrier of darkness to defend himself. Boundless pressure crashed down upon him. Enlin could sense the true divine might of the boundless realm suppression. These weren't crystals at all. They were clearly worlds that contained the essence of the heavenly Tao. That's right, the boundless realm suppression was a technique that tossed countless worlds toward it. Boom! The boundless realm suppression descended. All of the seawater in the white nectar sea was blasted hundreds of thousands of meters into the air, and the seawater continued to surge outward, creating an unimaginably gargantuan tsunami crashing into the distance. Enlin's darkness began to twist and warp, and his body creaked and groaned under the terrifying pressure, as if it could fall apart at any moment. If a god of creation like heavenly monarch Beluo were here, they would most likely have been reduced to mincemeat by this attack. That's right, this was an attack that even gods of creation were fearful of. However, Enlin still managed to hold on. Right at this moment, the heavenly sea god was already charging toward him with his golden trident in hand. Enlin, have a taste of my fork. Enlin flared up with rage upon seeing the heavenly sea god. F*CKU. He kicked the blue deity in front of him. The heavenly sea god stabbed his trident toward Enlin's foot, upon which energy exploded violently. Never would Enlin have thought that the heavenly sea god's trident would be able to tear through his darkness barrier and puncture a bloody hole into the sole of his foot. The boundless power of the ocean surged through the wound and into every part of his body. Enlin let loose a muffled groan as he hurtled back in retreat. During his retreat, he also had to withstand the boundless realm suppression in the sky, which was rapidly depleting his energy. It was still far too difficult to deal with two heavenly gods at the same time. Even for a top-rate powerful being like Enlin, this was a perilous situation. Heavenly god technique, illusionary flash. Enlin transformed into an illusionary shadow and fled into the distance, as if he had disappeared. Right at this moment, a streak of light quickly flashed toward him. You want to use an escape technique in front of me? I'll make sure you have nowhere to hide. The light goddess smiled at the illusionary shadow beside her, and a light that was even more dazzling than the sun erupted from her body. Everything could be seen clearly under her light. Enlin's illusionary shadow was invisible to begin with, but it was also transformed into a black entity by her light. Enlin's escape route was clearly visible to the heavenly heaven god. The heavenly heaven god didn't have any fancy tricks up its sleeves, and it unleashed another burst of boundless realm suppression toward Enlin, smashing Enlin directly into the seabed. Enlin was surrounded by 4 paramount heavenly gods, and even if he wanted to escape, it would be an extravagant hope. Chapter 2181. Enlin was once again crushed by the heavenly heaven god. The heavenly sea god stabbed his golden trident toward Enlin at an extremely fast speed, and Enlin could only barely evade, but a gash was still inflicted on his waist. Foot of the heavenly Tao. Enlin unleashed a kick toward the heavenly sea god as he evaded. A golden heaven-crushing kick erupted forth with complete darkness, enshrouding the heavenly sea god's entire body. The massive golden energy threatened to crush heaven and earth, and the seawater around the heavenly sea god's body was blasted apart. Meanwhile, the power of extreme darkness pierced straight into the heavenly sea god's core and punctured a massive hole into his massive body. Boom! A blood-curdling wail erupted, and the heavenly sea god hurtled back in retreat. This was the first time he had been wounded in his true Tao state. That was a state where he felt like he was invincible and omnipotent. Brother Enlin was already this powerful. At this moment, Enlin was trying to continue fleeing despite the heavenly heaven god suppression. Life, what are you doing? What are you waiting for? The heavenly sea god yelled. I'm coming. The heavenly life goddess charged toward Enlin. She was still in shock that her 2 paramount allies had been forced to reveal their true Tao forms, and she had yet to come to her senses after being sent flying by Enlin's kick. After all, this was an extremely grievous piece of news. How had the heavenly light goddess managed to bully these two to such an extent? Of course, she knew that this was not the time to be blaming anyone, and she immediately pounced toward Enlin without any hesitation. The deathly saber in her hand swelled to over 1,000 kilometers in size, slicing through the ocean before crashing down upon Enlin's body with the power to annihilate all things. Enlin didn't even raise his head before unleashing a kick of the heavenly Tao toward her. Boom! The heavenly life goddess let loose a blood-curdling wail as she was kicked flying again, and she threw up a mouthful of blood this time. The heavenly life goddess didn't unleash her true Tao state, so she was no match for Enlin and could only be bullied. Thankfully, heaven and earth weren't counting on the heavenly life goddess. All they wanted was for her to buy some time for Enlin. Myriad Aurora. The heavenly light goddess took aim at Enlin's back, and golden light transformed into countless peerless divine swords that tore through all obstacles before them before landing on Enlin's body. Countless light swords poured down like torrential rain, piercing through all nothingness and breaking through all darkness. This power was very pure and terrifying, and it could even purify Enlin's divine Tao of darkness into light. Enlin's dark feather robe emitted a burning sensation. He was extremely anxious and uneasy. He really hated this power. However, the heavenly light goddess attack wasn't powerful enough, or rather, her light wasn't powerful enough to suppress Enlin's darkness. Countless beams of light fell upon Enlin's body, but they were all absorbed by Enlin's feather cloak of darkness. Then, Enlin retaliated with a ball of darkness. In that instant, the heavenly light goddess felt a sense of terror descend upon her. She immediately retreated without any hesitation. However, she hadn't even retreated 50 kilometers before the black ball exploded, instantly engulfing everything within a radius of a few hundred kilometers. Everything, including the ocean, space, energy, and light, had been engulfed. All that was left was nothingness and darkness. Rip! A streak of light tore through the darkness, revealing an extremely disheveled figure. The heavenly light goddess' snowy white skin was stained with countless black spots. These black spots were like maggots that were extremely difficult to get rid of. Furthermore, they were frantically trying to engulf everything about her. I really do hate this power. The heavenly light goddess gritted her teeth with rage. There was actually something else that she didn't say. For some reason, aside from hating this power, she was also a little excited. It was as if she was going to do something and prove something. Enlin had only just unleashed his attack when he felt the space around him suddenly warp. Immediately afterward, an invisible blade tore through his darkness, and his arm was also cleanly severed. He didn't have any time to be astonished as he quickly evaded the attack. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. A series of inky black gashes suddenly appeared on the ground, extending to who knew how deep into the ground. Enlin quickly evaded the gashes, leaving a black gash in his wake with each flash. He was evading the invisible attacks. These attacks were extremely terrifying as they were imbued with the spatial powers of different worlds. Each and every attack was like a condensed version of the heavenly Tao body of a different world. His darkness could resist damage, but couldn't block the power of an entire world in an instant. Not only was it able to restrict his escape, but it was also able to unleash such a terrifying attack in the process. This heavenly heaven god, as expected, he was no ordinary person. A ferocious light flashed through Enlin's eyes as he looked up at the gargantuan figure in the sky. Even such a powerful being had a fatal flaw. Little Sierra. As he dodged, he shouted loudly. A black light flashed behind him, and a completely black blade appeared in his hand. Then, without even looking, he swung it at the sky from afar. Vanquish the heavens and slay all evil. Great annihilation. An invisible ripple began to expand rapidly. Bam! A resounding boom erupted. A massive hole was blasted into the heavenly heaven god's head. The heavenly heaven god also let loose a pained wail. Hateful, hateful humans. That's right. The heavenly heaven god's biggest flaw was that his body was too massive. He didn't even need to aim properly to attack his opponent. He could simply close his eyes and blow up his opponent's head. Of course, the prerequisite was that he had the power to attack his opponent. Enlin clearly had that ability. However, he didn't continue to battle. Instead, he took advantage of the instant that the heavenly heaven god was wounded to activate his shadow evasion technique again. Enlin only had the occasional opportunity to retaliate, and he wasn't going to be so arrogant as to think that he could take on 4 paramount heavenly gods at once. He only had 1 life left, so he couldn't afford to be reckless. Stop him. Don't let him get away. The heavenly sea god yelled. The heavenly sea god was the most astonished of all. and Lin had once again demonstrated to him just how powerful he was. To put it bluntly, if he didn't have his true form of Tao, and Lin would definitely be the most powerful among the 6 paramount heavenly gods. Even if they activated their true forms of Tao, they would only be able to match up to Enlin at most. Didn't they see what was happening now? 2 paramount heavenly gods and 2 other paramount heavenly gods who had activated their true forms of Tao had tried to kill Enlin, yet they were still being wounded by Enlin. Was this something that any other mighty figure could achieve? In any case, the heavenly sea god had never seen one before. The heavenly sea god was filled with killing intent toward Enlin. It's a little difficult to be a brother. I can't keep him around. At this moment, the heavenly light goddess and the heavenly life goddess had already positioned themselves in front of Enlin. Boundless light prison. Golden high-energy light intertwined to form a light prison that enshrouded Enlin within. Life clock. The heavenly life goddess tossed an antiquated clock toward Enlin. The heavenly sea god rushed behind Enlin with his pitchfork in his hand. Heavenly darkness god. You have nowhere to run. Chapter 2182. Enlin unleashed his darkness to engulf everything in front of him, only to be sliced into several pieces by the boundless light prison. The light prison's high-energy light prison was limitless, and the darkness could only engulf part of the light prison instead of the entirety of the light prison. At this moment, the clock that the heavenly life goddess had tossed toward Enlin had already begun to turn. However, it was spinning backward. Immediately afterward, the power of time began to spread throughout Enlin's entire body, and the hands on the clock began to spin faster and faster. Enlin could sense that the power within his body was weakening at an alarming rate. His darkness had also transformed from the purest form of darkness to a more ordinary darkness. Enlin's expression shifted. This fate bell had the ability to reverse the state of his body. It could reverse the flow of time in his life. That's right, Enlin felt like he had become younger. At the same time, his power was also rapidly decreasing. After all, he was becoming more and more powerful, and he would be super weak if he reverted to his original state. A few seconds later, Enlin felt like he didn't even know how to use his divine Tao of darkness anymore. At this moment, the heavenly sea god had already appeared behind Enlin, and he stabbed his golden ocean trident toward Enlin's back with all his might. Enlin wanted to evade, but his power was declining too quickly, and he was completely unable to evade such a swift and accurate attack. Excruciating pain instantly swept through his entire body. Ow, ow, ow. The power of the ocean surged toward him. He felt as if he'd been plunged into a deep ocean vortex, and he could be engulfed by the boundless ocean at any moment. This feeling, it was so comfortable. That's right, Enlin liked the heavenly sea god's power. The power of the ocean had something in common with darkness, and the heavenly sea god had said that they were good friends in the past, so Enlin believed him a little. However, this power allowed Enlin to regain his sense of darkness. He regained the enlightenment of darkness that he had lost after his life was reversed by the fate bell. Heavenly God technique. Eternal darkness. Enlin's eyes widened, and his pupils became as black as the deepest abyss. The chaotic vortex behind him reappeared, and the purest darkness erupted from his body at the same time. In the face of the darkness, the heavenly sea god insisted on leaving his golden trident within Enlin's body before unleashing his paramount power of the ocean to protect himself. The explosion of darkness was like an expanding black ball, flattening and twisting the heavenly sea god's protective spell technique. At the same time, the heavenly life god's bell of life had been completely devoured by the darkness. The heavenly life goddess hurtled back in retreat. She didn't dare to take Enlin's attack head-on. Enlin turned to look at the heavenly sea god with a grin. Brother Sea, do you really have to be so eager to kill me? The heavenly sea god's expression shifted slightly, and he unleashed his oceanic golden trident mercilessly. I don't know what you're talking about. Enlin's chest was instantly blasted open with a large bloody hole. The golden fluid continued to pierce into the rest of Enlin's flesh in the form of a spear through the bloody hole, like a hedgehog with golden fluid expanding outwards. Ouch, ouch, ouch. And Lin took a deep breath and gritted his teeth. He really was in a lot of pain. However, he didn't try to evade as his eternal darkness still hadn't ended. The darkness pressed against the ocean barrier in a frenzy, becoming more and more powerful and terrifying. The ocean also tried to retaliate, but the darkness was eternal, and no matter how much it tried to wear down the barrier, it would remain in place. The heavenly sea god couldn't hold on any longer. And Lin, don't get too carried away. The heavenly sea god finally retreated, but Lin's darkness transformed into a spear that pierced toward the heavenly sea god's chest at an even faster speed. What? The heavenly sea god's heart jolted. At this moment, the darkness had already torn through the ocean barrier and exploded upon piercing into the ocean barrier. Boom! An explosion of darkness blasted another massive hole into the heavenly sea god's body. Thank you for your reminder. I didn't get too carried away, so don't get too carried away either. And Lin chuckled coldly before flying into the distance. At this moment, the heavens crashed down again. Boom! Countless blue crystals imbued with the power of one realm crashed down upon Lin, trapping Lin in the seabed. You want to run? Aren't you being a little too naive? The heavenly heaven god glowered at Lin in the sky, and Lin struggled to break free, but the heavenly heaven god's charged attack was not going to be that easy to break free from. At this moment, the heavenly sea god, the heavenly life god, and the heavenly light god had already pounced toward him again while unleashing all types of terrifying heavenly god spell techniques. The battle in the White Nectar Sea had developed into a different kind of battle. The heaven-crushing United Army was initially gloating over the internal conflict between the supreme heavenly gods, but they were now panicking and uneasy as they saw the supreme heavenly gods suddenly stop fighting. Instead, they were attacking a being that could unleash darkness in a frenzy. They were too far away, so they couldn't see Lin's figure clearly. However, they could see that the darkness was capable of engulfing heaven and earth. They could also see the sky, the ocean, light, and life. For extremely terrifying powers were tearing the darkness apart. They didn't even need to think about it to know what that darkness represented. This was the #1 war god in the war against the heavenly human tribe, the paramount heavenly god of darkness, and Lin. The situation was beginning to worsen. The heaven-crushing United Army was extremely concerned. Everyone knew that Lin was in dire straits. The combined attacks of the 4 paramount heavenly gods was definitely an unimaginable calamity, and it was also the most powerful force that the heavenly human tribe could muster. However, Lin was only one person. How was he going to defend himself? Many powerful beings had even volunteered to fight to the death just so that Lin could have a chance of survival during his escape. However, all of these requests were immediately rejected by Lan Xiaoni. Alliance leader Lan, please let us go. War god Lin is in the most dire straits in history, and we're willing to fight to the death with War god Lin. A return to Void stage mighty figure said with tears in his eyes. Lin is risking his life for the sake of the Tai Chu continent. Why can he risk his life for the sake of the continent, but we can't? A Dao integration stage super mighty figure chimed in. All of the powerful beings chimed in unison. You're not risking your life. You're going to die. Lan Xiaoni looked at the explosions in the distance with a firm expression. Our mission is to protect Yutong City. All of the powerful beings were still protesting. All of them revered Lin and loved the entire continent, so they were all volunteering to fight to the death at this critical juncture. However, Lan Xiaoni was like a mountain that stood in the way of all of the powerful beings who wanted to help Lin. Anyone who tried to get out would have to be forced back in. Lan Xiaoni wanted to charge in a battle more than anyone else, but she knew that she couldn't. Su Xiaolan had already entrusted her with the responsibility of defending Yutong City, so she had to see this through to the end. This was not only to protect the heaven-crushing United Army, but it was also so that Lin wouldn't be distracted by the battle. She wasn't powerful enough to help Lin in a battle of that caliber. Big Sister Xiaolan you have to make it. Big Boss and Lin, you have to make it back alive. Underling Lan will be waiting for you right here, always waiting for you. The mermaid princess stood at the top of the city wall. Her blue eyes reflected the light of the explosion in the distance as she softly prayed. Chapter 2183. Lin was currently in the most dire situation he had ever been in. He was also facing the most powerful enemy he had ever faced. He had tried all types of methods to escape from the four paramount heavenly gods, but all of them had failed. Furthermore, the energy within his body was also rapidly depleting. If things continued like this, even if he didn't die from severe injuries, he would still die from exhaustion. Damn it, how had things come to this? Lin was extremely exasperated and indignant. Plans always failed to keep up with developments. He had initially thought that he would be able to easily escape from the two paramount heavenly gods. Who would have thought that he would have to face two paramount heavenly gods who had attained the true form of Tao? And they had even added a light and a life to them. What evil intentions! The heavenly sea god slashed Lin's neck with his golden trident again. This brother of his was always the one who had injured him the most. And Lin was very pained by this, and he wanted to reveal the fact that he was working with the heavenly sea god. However, the paramount beings wouldn't believe him even if he told them about this. In fact, they would think that he was trying to slander them. After all, the heavenly sea god was trying so hard to kill him, so he didn't look like his brother at all. It would be more accurate to say that he was an enemy. This was what made Lin so sad. He was very isolated and helpless. Right at this moment, a vermilion bird let loose a loud cry in the distance. Crimson holy flames lit up heaven and earth, incinerating the heavens. There was a powerful aura rushing toward Lin at an extremely fast speed, as if it were a moth flying toward its prey with no regard for its own safety. And Lin's heart jolted at the sight of that figure. Xiaolan. In his most isolated and helpless moment, a woman stood up without any regard for her own safety. No, no. And Lin immediately shook his head with a concerned and imploring expression on his face. Go back, listen to me, go back. It was still too early for Su Xiaolan to get involved in this battle. Who dares to use flames to challenge my authority? A mighty voice sounded from the heavens. In the blink of an eye, the scarlet saint fire that covered the sky was completely dispersed, and the huge Wuji body reappeared. The heavenly heaven god finally caught a glimpse of the woman in a jade dress. Divine Phoenix Maiden. Very good. You've come at the right time. I'll take care of you as well. The heavenly heaven god was not enraged. Instead, he chuckled. Taking advantage of the fact that he was in his true Tao form, he had to get rid of as many powerful enemies as he could. It would be best if they all ran over to him one by one, like the Calabash brothers, saving their grandpa. Su Xiaolan held the dragon sparrow sword in her hand, and her gaze lingered on the man who was being sealed at the bottom of the white jade sea. Her voice reverberated through the heavens like a holy voice. Anyone who dares to offend me, and Lin, must die. An earth-shattering light burst forth from the dragon sparrow sword. The transcendent and ethereal aura of a saint was released without reservation. Su Xiaolan swung her dragon sparrow sword through the air, and she transformed into a massive vermilion bird materialized from the holy vermilion flame. She let loose a loud cry before pouncing toward the massive humanoid figure in the sky. This scene looked like a peerless firebird pouncing on a pure, white humanoid god. It was an extremely spectacular and mystical scene. The heavenly heaven god focused its gaze, and layers of space began to crush down upon the vermilion bird. The sharp barrier blades tore through its flaming wings, causing it to wail with anguish. Countless crimson flames rained down from the sky like a crimson meteor shower. The vermilion bird was in a lot of pain, but it still pounced toward the heavenly heaven god in a frenzy. The heavenly heaven god had no choice but to relinquish its control over Lin and focus more of its power on the vermilion bird. Heaven-shattering strike. The heavenly heaven god extended a hand toward the vermilion bird, and a massive net of spatial rifts appeared over its pristine white palm, making it appear as if the entire heavens were being sliced apart. The vermilion bird had nowhere to evade, and its body was instantly shattered into cubes of flames. The heavenly heaven god thought that it had successfully sealed the divine Phoenix Maiden. However, to its surprise, a woman in a jade dress flew out from within the shattered holy vermilion flame like an azure dragon, and her sword flashed through the air before striking the heavenly heaven god's face with devastating force. A true dragon roared, and a lightning dragon tore through the heavenly god's face. The humanoid face in the sky was sliced in half. The heavenly heaven god roared with rage and pain. Die! The heavenly heaven god roared. Boom! The space in front of Su Xiaolan suddenly exploded, shattering the space within a radius of several thousand kilometers. The azure-robed figure finally plummeted to the ground. Enlin took advantage of the moment when the heavenly heaven god was distracted by Su Xiaolan to escape from the heavenly sea god's pursuit, upon which he rushed over and cradled Su Xiaolan in his arms. He hadn't felt this way in a long time. However, Enlin was enraged by the woman's disordered aura and the gashes on her body. You shouldn't have come. Enlin flew toward Yutong City with the injured Su Xiaolan in his arms. Su Xiaolan opened her eyes and stared at the man before her with a faint smile on her face. You only have a chance to live because I'm here. And Lin had indeed taken advantage of this opportunity to escape. He had covered several thousand kilometers in the blink of an eye, and he was rapidly approaching the edge of the White Nectar Sea. As long as he left the White Nectar Sea and the core of the Tai Chu continent's ocean, the heavenly sea god's combat prowess would most likely be significantly diminished. You're not getting away. The heavenly sea god roared at Enlin as he swung his golden trident through the air, upon which an ocean imbued with extreme power of the ocean appeared before Enlin and Su Xiaolan, thereby keeping them at bay. It was as if a boundless wall of ocean had suddenly appeared before them, connecting heaven and earth, and the boundless power of the ocean within it was capable of engulfing all living beings. Su Xiaolan held onto Enlin's hand tightly. Follow me. Within Enlin's sea of vital energy, the little vermilion bird suddenly began to throb. Its power was completely unleashed to resonate with Su Xiaolan's power. Holy flames that were extremely scorching and pure exploded. The clear cry of the vermilion bird erupted. The two of them transformed into vermilion birds that flapped their wings and soared high into the sky, drawing a stunning arc in the night sky. Under the pure and holy flames, there were also wisps of black dancing silk wrapped around the vermilion bird's wings. Wherever they passed, not only would they incinerate everything, but they would also be able to devour everything. In that instant, the holy beast vermilion bird had fused perfectly with the divine Tao of darkness, creating an effect that was greater than two. Boom! The vermilion bird plunged headfirst into the wall of ocean. The boundless power of the paramount heavenly gods within the ocean was eroding the vermilion bird's power in a frenzy. Everything before them was a vast expanse of darkness, and it felt as if they were falling into an abyss. However, Enlin was not afraid of this. Su Xiaolan held on to Enlin's hand, and she was not afraid at all. This was the most powerful holy beast vermilion bird in history, and it was advancing relentlessly. The heavenly sea god's expression shifted drastically as he sensed the situation within the ocean. This penetrative power was even more terrifying than the heavenly light god's light of two realms. Within a few seconds, the entire ocean had been transformed into a twisted, fiery color. The seawater had completely evaporated, and an extremely proud vermilion bird broke through. Chapter 2184. The vermilion bird broke through the heavenly sea god's ocean barrier and flew into the air. All of the heaven-crushing united army erupted into raucous cheers upon seeing this. The holy vermilion flame was extremely dazzling at this moment. To them, this was a light countless times more beautiful than the sun. All of the Tao integration stage vermilion birds from the vermilion bird realm were completely entranced by this sight. They had even forgotten to chant, "Long live Great Empress Vermilion Bird," as they stared blankly with scorching passion in their eyes. The vermilion bird in the distance was the most beautiful and powerful vermilion bird they had ever seen. The powerful and unique holy birth aura fused with the aura of the heavenly Tao of darkness and fused perfectly with all things in this world, thereby making it even more transcendent and holy. Not only that, but even the black ribbons around the vermilion bird's wings were like a beautiful woman in a black evening gown, giving it a regal and cold appearance. The heavenly sea god unleashed the power within his body in a frenzy, materializing one ocean barrier after another before the vermilion bird. However, the vermilion bird was unstoppable, and it was able to burn a massive hole into its body with every attack. The heavenly sea god was completely unable to stop Enlin and Su Xiaolan. Enlin and Su Xiaolan were holding hands even as they fled, as if they were eloping. The heavenly light goddess and the heavenly life goddess also tried to stop them, but they were all knocked flying by the vermilion bird or swatted away by its wings. Su Xiaolan glared coldly at the two beautiful women in front of her. "You two seductive cheese want to steal my Enlin? You're overestimating yourselves." Soon, they arrived at the edge of the white nectar sea. Hope was right in front of them. "Heavenly sea god, how long are you going to wait?" The heavenly sea god roared. "We're ready." The heavenly heaven god's voice sounded. The gargantuan white humanoid figure in the sky suddenly began to move. Its massive legs began to move, and its body, which was parallel to the ground, began to stand upright. Its feet swept through the air above Tong City, sweeping up destructive gale-force winds and twisting spatial ripples in its wake. It was hard to imagine what kind of leg it was, nor could it describe what kind of speed it possessed. The leg bent and kicked fiercely towards the fleeing vermilion bird. The vermilion bird, whose wings could cover thousands of miles, was already an unimaginably colossal creature. However, compared to that foot, which was tens of thousands of miles long, the vermilion bird was simply an existence smaller than a chick. "There's no way to dodge this move. We can only take it head on." And Lin said, "Yes, we will definitely make it." Su Xiaolan nodded. The two of them merged their powers together and charged forward even more fearlessly. The sea was roaring crazily. The light was flickering. Life was announcing its death. The sky was covering the sun, and the sky was crushing down. The entire world was targeting them, wanting them dead. The two of them were like birds that wanted to escape from being hunted down by the heavens. They wanted to fly higher, fly further, fearlessly charge forward. God vanquishing heavenly ocean. The heavenly sea god stabbed his golden trident into the sky. The crimson ocean fell from the sky, and countless dead gods also appeared from within it. All of them wailed with anguish as tears of blood flowed from their eyes. All of them unleashed countless divine techniques to control the vermilion bird down below. Then, the ocean crashed down mercilessly upon the vermilion bird's back. Boundless pressure weighed down upon Enlin and Su Xiaolan at the same time, but they still continued to fly forward with no regard for the consequences. The bright light high energy cannon was like a heavenly sword piercing through the sky, lighting up the world and emitting an extremely dazzling light. Any living being that looked directly at the cannon would only see a vast expanse of gold in front of their eyes, and they wouldn't be able to see the body of the cannon at all. Enlin and Su Xiaolan could sense the impending danger, and they forced themselves to evade. However, the cannon still managed to puncture one of the vermilion bird's wings, thereby significantly reducing their flight speed. At this moment, the ocean parted, and countless green vines with extremely fearsome life force that were immune to fire rose into the sky. They bound the vermilion bird's wings, neck, and feet tightly. The vermilion bird faltered again. At this moment, the heavenly heaven god's foot was already upon them. Any living being would fall into despair in the face of so many terrifying spell techniques from the four paramount heavenly gods. However, Enlin and Su Xiaolan's expressions were still filled with determination and fighting spirit. "As long as we can break through this attack, we'll be able to escape. Let's attack together and unleash all of our power." and Lin and Su Xiaolan both unleashed their maximum power in that instant, unleashing all of the power within their bodies at once. In that instant, the vermilion bird's holy might expanded to hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Over 100 million heavenly human tribe powerful beings had fled into the distance, and they were still cheering for the heavenly phoenix maiden and the heavenly dark god 1 second ago. However, in the next second, all of them plummeted to the ground from the sky, which was filled with unyielding battle intent. The vermilion bird's body quickly expanded to over 1,000 kilometers in size. The god vanquishing heavenly ocean in the sky was being incinerated, and the vines down below were also being scorched red by the scorching flames. There was hope that it would be able to break free. However, there wasn't enough time. At this moment, the heavenly heaven god's charged attack had already crashed into the vermilion bird. In that instant, heaven and earth instantly fell dark. Boom! The red and blue energies exploded at this moment. Heaven and earth shook. The explosion of energy twisted and distorted even the laws of the Tai Chu continent, and it was like a boundless ball of energy that was expanding outward, engulfing space, incinerating the ocean, and shattering heaven and earth. This clash was far too terrifying. Even the Yu Tong divine city in the distance had to activate its heaven-punishing formation to protect itself. The heavenly human tribe powerful beings that were closer to the battle were in a much more dire situation. Some of the weaker ones were bleeding from all of their orifices, while the more powerful ones were feeling as if they could be killed at any moment. If it weren't for the fact that there were heavenly gods protecting them, at least half of these heavenly humans would have perished. They discovered that it wouldn't be safe no matter how far they ran, but they still had no choice but to flee in a panic. Now, they were about to reach the heaven-crushing alliance's headquarters. This collision could be said to be able to destroy an alternate world in an instant. Thankfully, the Tai Chu continent was sturdy enough, so it wasn't able to damage the foundation of this world. However, the White Nectar Sea was almost completely obliterated by that devastating explosion. The White Nectar Sea was still there, but all of the living beings in it had already died. The energy began to dissipate slowly. All the experts were on high alert. He nervously looked at the center of the collision. They all wanted to know, but what in the end? Would Lin and Su Xiaolan be able to escape from the 4 paramount heavenly gods? Chapter 2185. The heavenly heaven god let loose a muffled groan before slowly withdrawing its foot. Half of its foot had been blasted to smithereens, and there were still indestructible flames burning on its foot. It had clearly been severely wounded, and Lin and Su Xiaolan's gargantuan vermilion bird had already been kicked into oblivion. Both of them had been wounded to varying degrees. Su Xiaolan was the most severely wounded, and her jade dress was riddled with wounds from the spatial power of the heavenly heaven god realm. She had expended a vast amount of blood essence to materialize the vermilion bird, and she was lying in Lin's arms in exhaustion. And Lin held Su Xiaolan in one arm, while unleashing a relentless stream of the paramount power of darkness with his other hand to keep the god-vanquishing heavenly ocean at bay. The goddess of life's indestructible vines had been destroyed, but the heavenly sea god's ocean was still there, and Lin gritted his teeth as his entire body trembled uncontrollably. It was quite clear that he had reached his limit. What should they do now? One was severely wounded, while the other was completely exhausted. How were they supposed to escape from the paramount heavenly gods? Even if Su Xiaolan were to join the battle, it would still be difficult for them to escape from the pincer attack of the paramount heavenly gods. The paramount heavenly gods were powerful not only because of their immense power, but also because of their boundless energy, as well as their undying and regenerative abilities. The heavenly heaven god's shattered foot was already healing at a rate discernible to the naked eye. The heavenly light goddess and the heavenly life goddess were already preparing to attack. The heavenly sea god's god vanquishing heavenly ocean continued to suppress Lin. And Lin was resisting with all his might, but how long could he hold on for? If they couldn't find a crucial flaw or a unique way out, the two of them would definitely be buried here. What should they do? Did they really have to sacrifice their lives? And Lin looked at the woman in his arms, and she looked back at him. No, no. Su Xiaolan seemed to have realized something, and she gripped tightly onto Lin's wrist as she shook her head with difficulty. There has to be another way. That's right, there must be another way. And Lin smiled. He couldn't bear to leave Xiaolan forever. Everything had a chance. And Lin used the heavens divination technique again. This time, he discovered something that gave him a pleasant surprise. There was another god of creation near their battle, and Lin's eyes were as dark as ink as he stared in a certain direction. Finally, he discovered a figure in the shadows. It was a graceful woman dressed in a black robe. The woman seemed to sense Lin's gaze. She raised her head, revealing her delicate and gentle face. However, there was an incomparably complicated expression in her eyes as she looked at Lin. And Lin immediately knew who it was and hurriedly transmitted his voice. Nuwa, you came at the right time. Are you here to save us? When Nuwa, who was far away, heard this, her expression became even more complicated. She shook her head and said, I'm here to save Su Xiaolan. As for you, I'm sorry, but I can't save you. And Lin was stunned at first. Then, he thought of something, and a bitter expression appeared on his face. You know everything? Nuwa nodded. Yes, I know everything. And Lin was the heavenly darkness god. The heavenly darkness god had to sacrifice his life to mend the heavens. Now, he only had 1/5 of his Tao power left before he could complete the most crucial step of mending the heavens. Nuwa knew all of this, and Lin understood Nuwa's actions very well. Nuwa was the kind of being who was willing to sacrifice herself for the sake of others. This was evident from the fact that she was a supreme god of the demon race. She could have disregarded everything else, but she still fought bravely against the heavens. She could sacrifice her own demon race citizens, so she could naturally sacrifice Lin as well. To be honest, Nuwa was already being merciful enough by not cooperating with the supreme, heavenly god and chasing after him with her saber. It wasn't that Nuwa hadn't thought about this before. In reality, Nuwa had come here to ponder how to kill Lin. Then, she saw an extremely shocking scene unfold. It was no exaggeration to say that the intensity and power of this battle ranked in the top 3 of all the battles that she had experienced. She saw how powerful the paramount heavenly gods were, as well as Lin's desperate struggle. She should have been very happy to see that Lin was in a perilous situation and was about to sacrifice his life. She didn't need to do anything, and her plan to mend the heavens would proceed smoothly. However, she couldn't bring herself to be happy, and Lin was clearly already so powerful. So why was Lin still putting himself in such a perilous situation? Why was he in such a perilous situation? Wasn't it for the sake of the entire continent? Wasn't it for the sake of all the living beings in this world? How could Nuwa be happy to see such a mighty hero die for the sake of all the living beings in this world? She was feeling very conflicted at this moment. She had already made up her mind, but her resolve began to waver upon seeing this. How many tens of thousands of years had it been since she had felt this way? Xiaolan, I'll get you out of here. And Lin held Su Xiaolan tightly in his arms with a determined expression. Yes, I believe in you. Su Xiaolan was already severely wounded and completely exhausted, but the light in her eyes had not been extinguished. And Lin took a deep breath, and countless divine patterns of darkness appeared on his body. Boundless darkness erupted from his feet, which rapidly proliferated into the surroundings like inky black rings. The darkness encompassed an extremely large area, and it even encompassed the area of the god vanquishing heavenly ocean. Even the god vanquishing heavenly ocean above Lin's head faltered slightly. Regardless of whether it was the terrifying power of the ocean or the anguished wails and attacks of the deceased gods, all of it ceased in that instant, only to be replaced by eternal silence and darkness. Just the Tao realm alone was enough to affect the heavenly sea god's attacks. And Lin unleashed a high-rank war, god mystic technique at this moment. Dark, immortal transformation. And Lin sprang into action like a black shadow, and nothing could hinder his advance, including the ocean above his head. After completing his divine Tao of darkness, the dark immortal transformation had already provided him with very little enhancements. However, any enhancements in his power now were crucial. And Lin was going to squeeze out all of the power within his body to unleash an instant invincibility. He was extremely fast, so fast that even the vines of the heavenly life goddess, the light of the heavenly light goddess, and even the surging ocean were unable to catch up to him. Trap him. The heavenly heaven god unleashed an all-encompassing attack, and the space within a radius of 500 kilometers around him Lin congealed over 10,000 times over. No living being, including gods of creation, could ignore this all-encompassing sealing technique. The heavenly heaven god's power encompassed the entire sky. However, just as the heavenly heaven god was brimming with confidence, the black shadow was able to ignore space in that instant, and in the instant that the heavenly heaven god sprang into action, both the black shadow and Su Xiaolan disappeared. Then, the black shadow reconstructed its life form in the darkness before continuing its escape. Chapter 2186. There's a movement technique like this. The heavenly heaven god was given a fright. The sea god, light god, and life god's expressions also shifted. This kind of movement technique was even more terrifying than spatial skipping. Spatial skipping required the use of space, and the heavenly heaven god was the ruler of space and realms. As such, he could completely crush Enlin. However, the movement technique Enlin was using was the disintegration and reconstruction of an object. It was as if he was using darkness to completely destroy an object so that the heavenly god's attacks would lose their target. Then, he would use darkness to perfectly recreate that object. An escape technique of this level was completely different from a spatial jump. The difference in difficulty was like the difference between heaven and earth. Only darkness could accomplish such a feat. The heavenly sea god tossed another sea toward Enlin upon seeing that Enlin had broken free of his sea. However, Enlin's darkness disintegration and reconstruction technique allowed him to travel over 1,500 kilometers and evade the sea again. Enlin had completely escaped from the White Nectar Sea. However, the four paramount heavenly gods were still unwilling to give up. Chase him. He won't be able to last much longer with this kind of escape technique. Let's run. He can run for a minute, but he won't be able to run for 2. Let's see how many more spells he can dodge. The four paramount heavenly gods pursued him relentlessly. A sense of unease welled up in Su Xiaolan's heart at the sight of Enlin's current state. Enlin was trying too hard, to the point where it was a little abnormal. Just as the four paramount heavenly gods had said, this kind of escape technique was clearly a hopeless one. He could only escape for a while. Once he ran out of energy, he would fall into an even more desperate situation. Enlin, what are you trying to do? Su Xiaolan looked at the man before her. Enlin looked down at the concerned woman in his arms with a comforting smile. It's all right. We'll definitely be able to survive. Boom! A black figure flew through the air. 4 heaven-shaking, earth-shattering auras locked onto that tiny black figure, locked onto that seemingly isolated and helpless black figure. All of the members of the Heaven-Crushing Sex United Army were on tenterhooks. The members of the God of Destruction team could not wait to rush over and shield Enlin from behind. They wanted to buy one more second for Enlin. Close, very close. Enlin was burning with everything, his eyes shining brightly as he looked forward. At this time, a woman who was also in the shadows opened a wooden door. There was a faint golden light behind the door. The heavenly sea god unleashed another attack. Enlin and Su Xiaolan were once again engulfed by the darkness and disintegrated. Not again. Let's see how many times you can unleash such a powerful escape technique. The heavenly sea god chuckled coldly as he gripped his golden trident. Something's wrong. The heavenly heaven god's expression shifted drastically upon sensing the extremely minute fluctuations between the two worlds as soon as Niwa unleashed her wooden gate. There are other gods of creation present. The heavenly heaven god exclaimed. The expressions of the other three paramount heavenly gods changed drastically upon hearing this. At this moment, the four Empyrean gods began to sense a black-robed woman. It's Nuwa. Nuwa, do you want to fight against the heavens? Stop right now. The wrath of the paramount heavenly gods was not to be underestimated. Weaker gods of creation would most likely be trembling in the face of such terrifying pressure. However, the black-robed woman with clear, gentle eyes was still standing there silently, awaiting Enlin's arrival. Darkness surged, and Enlin appeared before Nuwa. Su Xiaolan was extremely elated. She finally figured out Enlin's plan. Nuwa was already here, and they could escape to the world created by Nuwa to seek refuge. She then felt a burst of power within her body hurl her toward the gate of light. Furthermore, her power had been completely sealed, so she was completely unable to resist. Su Xiaolan turned to look at Enlin, only to discover Enlin's apologetic and reluctant expression. She seemed to have understood something, and she struggled frantically as she yelled, "No, no." Enlin had a gentle expression on his face. "Wait for me to come back." Tears welled up in Su Xiaolan's eyes as her body was gradually engulfed by the gate of light. Nuwa looked at Enlin, and her lips moved slightly, but she didn't say the words that she had been hiding in her heart in the end. Instead, she turned around and left. "Enlin, take care." A voice that was as refreshing as spring water flowed forth. The gate of light also quickly shrank and disappeared at this moment. The four paramount heavenly gods were about to jump up and curse at Nuwa's sudden intervention, but they were instantly dumbstruck by the sight of Enlin tossing Su Xiaolan into the gate of light. What was going on? Why wasn't he running? He clearly wanted to run, but he wasn't doing so now. There could only be one reason. Nuwa didn't want him to run, so Nuwa was his F***king teammate. The four heavenly gods were ecstatic to see this play out like this. However, when they thought about how they had been forced to reveal their true Tao forms, they felt that it was quite dramatic as well. What right did they have to laugh at Enlin? Heavenly Sea and Heavenly Sea couldn't laugh anymore. They began to glare at Enlin with rage in their eyes. In reality, they could accept Su Xiaolan running away. However, if Nuwa dragged Enlin into the Gate of Light, they would have to use extreme force to drag Enlin out of Nuwa's world again. In their hearts, Enlin was already someone who had to die. What a touching scene. He wants his Tao partner to survive even before he dies. The heavenly life goddess flew toward Enlin with a wide smile on her face. I knew it. So this is what you were thinking. The heavenly light goddess's body glowed with a dazzling light as she slowly flew toward Enlin. Enlin, you've already done your last thing? Can I send you on your way now? The heavenly sea god wielded his golden trident as he strode over the ocean. You have nowhere to run. Accept your fate. The heavenly heaven god's gargantuan face had already obscured the entire sky above Enlin. Nothing could escape his eyes. Enlin chuckled as he looked at the boundless might unleashed by the four paramount heavenly gods. I, Enlin, have created so many miracles in my life, but I don't believe in accepting my fate the most. You don't have the right to decide my fate, even if you are the heavens. Boom! Darkness soared into the sky like ink. If you want to fight, then come at me together. I, Enlin, am not afraid of you. Enlin unleashed an earth-shattering sword projection that threatened to engulf heaven and earth. The white light of the sky, the golden power of light, the green power of life, and the deep blue water of the ocean all clashed with the darkness in a frenzy. Heaven and earth trembled, and the heavens wept tears of blood. An apocalyptic battle erupted once again. Countless powerful beings were spectating this battle. This was the most terrifying battle of all. All of them were extremely grief-stricken, and some of them even burst into tears. This battle signified that an indomitable war god was about to leave them forever. They all knew that this was most likely Enlin's final moment of glory. 15 minutes later, a figure riddled with wounds fell to the ground. Enlin's aura was extremely feeble, and his entire body was riddled with wounds. Both of his arms had been severed, and one of his legs had been crippled. His chest was riddled with wounds. He had finally exhausted all of his power. The four paramount heavenly gods looked down at him with cold, merciless eyes. Ding dong. Detected that the host is on the brink of death. Are you willing to sacrifice 1/5 of your life? The host will receive unimaginable power. Note, after this sacrifice, the host will die forever and return to the heavenly Tao. The system's voice sounded in his mind. There was simply too much information imbued within this sentence. At this moment, the attacks of the paramount heavenly gods descended upon Enlin again, obscuring the heavens as death enveloped his entire body. Enlin opened his mouth with great difficulty. All of a sudden, a crack appeared. A slender, fair hand grabbed onto Enlin's clothes. Giant Enlin. A clear and melodious voice that sounded like the sounds of nature rang in his ears. Chapter 2187. Was he going to die in the end? Had it finally come to this? So he really was going to die after using the last fifth of his life force. He really was going to be wiped from existence. The system wouldn't lie to him, but he was very unwilling to give up. He had told Su Xiaolan to wait for his return. If he didn't come back, Su Xiaolan would definitely continue to wait for him for countless years. As such, he couldn't break his promise. He couldn't die. He definitely couldn't die. And Lin's extremely strong will and conviction seemed to have broken through some kind of shackle at this moment. A twisted crack suddenly appeared in the space in front of him, and a fair and slender little hand grabbed his collar. Giant Enlin. This was the most beautiful and pleasant voice in this world. It sounded right beside Enlin's ear. This was a familiar voice that he hadn't heard in a long time. Little nod. Enlin's eyes widened. Before he had a chance to get excited, the little hand suddenly exerted force and dragged him into the twisted rift. The four paramount heavenly gods all exploded with rage upon seeing this. No, why is there a god of creation? Hurry, stop her, heavenly god. We can't let Enlin get away. Boom, boom, boom. The paramount heavenly gods' attacks had already crashed down upon them. The earth was cleansed by terrifying energy, but the rift had already disappeared. Enlin's aura had disappeared from the entire heaven and earth. Impossible. What's going on? The heavenly life goddess's expression was filled with confusion and astonishment. Who is that female god of creation? Why is that god of creation able to approach us without us noticing? The heavenly light goddess was also quite perplexed as she turned to look at the heavenly heaven god. One had to realize that the heavenly heaven god was currently in his true Tao form, yet she was able to conceal herself from him. Just how powerful did she have to be able to do this? The heavenly sea god continued to thrust his golden trident toward the spot where Enlin had just disappeared. The space within a radius of over 50 kilometers had been pulverized by the golden trident, but the heavenly sea god's rage was still not quelled. Attack! Don't let Enlin escape. We were so close, so close. Sky, why didn't you stop them? The heavenly sea god roared. The heavenly heaven god's expression was extremely dark. I can't stop them. He should know the coordinates of the Genesis Great World, right? Let's follow this point and forcefully break through the barrier between the two worlds. Then, we'll go to their world and kill Enlin, the light god said. But we'll suffer severe backlash if we do that, the life goddess said. We don't have a way out. You can feel how powerful Enlin is, right? This is the best opportunity to kill Enlin. The heavenly sea god was extremely determined. Thus, the three paramount heavenly gods all turned toward the heavenly heaven god. The heavenly heaven god's expression was still very dark. I can't locate her coordinates. Not only that, but I can't even locate the coordinates that she used to open up the passageway between the two worlds, the heavenly sea god. The heavenly light goddess and the heavenly life goddess were also dumbstruck. All of them stared at the heavenly heaven god with incredulity, feeling as if they were looking at a fake heavenly heaven god. The paramount god who ruled over the heavens and realms couldn't even find the coordinates of a god of creation in its true form. What a joke. Were they supposed to allow an unknown god of creation to save Enlin from the combined attacks of four paramount heavenly gods before escaping? I can locate the coordinates of the Nuwa world. How about we go capture the divine Phoenix Maiden? The heavenly heaven god was also feeling very awkward, and he tried to salvage his dignity. Are we going to suffer the backlash of a top-rate god of creation's great world just to capture the divine Phoenix Maiden? Have we gone insane? The heavenly sea god chuckled coldly. Thus, everyone fell silent again. All of the paramount heavenly gods looked around at the empty space before them, and their faces began to burn with embarrassment. It was extremely awkward to stay here for even a second longer. 4 paramount heavenly gods had surrounded Enlin, but they had come up empty-handed. If word of this got out, they would be bringing shame to the entire heavens. However, there was no need for word of this to get out. Everyone had seen this, and word of this was going to spread across the entire continent. Lan Xiaoni stood on the city wall of Yutong City, and she wept tears of joy as she announced the news to the entire city. The divine Phoenix Maiden had been rescued by Nuwa, and sect leader Enlin had also been rescued by a mysterious god of creation. The paramount heavenly god's plan had failed. The entire city erupted into a frenzy upon hearing this. One powerful being after another yelled into the sky with flushed faces. All of the soldiers hugged one another as their hearts were filled with joy. Some of them had even knelt to the ground and burst into tears and laughter at the same time. Even they didn't know that Enlin held such an important position in their hearts, and that Enlin's near-death experience was able to shake them to such an extent. Thankfully, Enlin had managed to escape from the 4 paramount heavenly gods. This was fantastic news for them. This was even more exciting than if they had won an earth-shattering battle. The heaven-crushing united army was ecstatic. After a brief period of elation, Lan Xiaoni regained her composure and announced that the entire city was ready for battle again. The paramount heavenly gods had lost their target, Enlin, and were most likely going to unleash their wrath upon Yutong City, so they had to prepare for the worst-case scenario. All of the soldiers gathered their composure upon hearing this order and began to prepare the city protection formation. Lan Xiaoni was already a qualified leader. Many living beings had witnessed her arduous journey to become a leader of this army. She had evolved from a crybaby to a leader who could command respect from the vast majority of powerful beings. This was no easy feat. She was still faced with a massive challenge, but she wasn't going to back down. Even in the face of such dire straits, Big Boss and didn't give up easily. As his underling, how could she disgrace Big Boss? In another place, there were also a few experts who were very excited and happy. They were the battling Buddha and the others who had gone with Enlin to carry out the mission. Not a single member of the Gods of Destruction team had been sacrificed, and they had reaped great rewards. This made them feel extremely proud and confident at the same time. The battle is not over yet. Let's return to Yutong City first. All right, we'll defend Yutong City to the death and await Enlin's return. Everyone's battle intent surged as they quickly traveled toward Yutong City. At this moment, on the battlefield of the 4 paramount heavenly gods, all of the paramount heavenly gods had finally recovered from the heavy blow of Enlin's escape. Let's destroy Yutong City while it's still in its true form. The heavenly heaven god felt like there was a ball of rage in his chest that he couldn't vent. That's right. The living beings in Yutong City are the main force of the heaven-crushing united army. If we destroy them, we'll only need to hold off Enlin and the others, and the heavenly human tribe will be able to destroy the rest of the human race. The heavenly light goddess chimed in. The heavenly sea god turned toward the heavenly light goddess with a meaningful gaze. I think we should force the heavenly light goddess to reveal her true form first before we attack Yutong City together. The heavenly light goddess. The heavenly heaven god's eyes lit up upon hearing this. After fighting alongside the heavenly sea god for a while, he had almost mistaken the heavenly light goddess for a teammate. The heavenly sea god's words had enlightened him. Chapter 2188. At this moment, the heavenly light goddess really wanted to curse the heavenly sea god. Why was this heavenly sea god always thinking about screwing over his teammates? At the very least, I fought alongside you against Enlin. How can you suddenly change your attitude? Do you not want her dignity as a supreme heavenly god anymore? The heavenly light goddess had already cursed the heavenly sea god 1,000 times in her mind. However, she still maintained a friendly and calm expression on her face. She smiled and said, "We have a common enemy. If we start a civil war now, our enemies will laugh at us." The heavenly sea god remained unmoved upon hearing this. "If we don't take this opportunity to unleash your true Tao form now, we'll become the real joke here." Heavenly light goddess. The heavenly heaven god felt like the heavenly sea god's words were very reasonable. The two paramount heavenly gods had already been forced to reveal their true Tao forms, so it would be a joke if they were to vent their anger on Yutong City. This was a situation of blood loss. If they waited for the heavenly light goddess to complete her transformation, then even if they managed to force out the heavenly light goddess Tao origin form, they would probably still be killed by the heavenly light goddess. In other words, this was the final opportunity to force the heavenly light goddess to reveal her trump card. The heavenly life goddess didn't say anything, and her actions of secretly accumulating power exposed her current thoughts. Strange ripples began to appear in the sky, sealing off the space within a radius of 10,000 kilometers. Boundless seas began to appear around the heavenly light goddess. All three paramount heavenly gods were thinking the same thing at this moment. The heavenly light goddess heaved a faint sigh upon seeing this. She had initially planned to force out Enlin's final life sacrifice and suppress the three paramount heavenly gods so that she could seize the opportunity to escape. Who would have thought that her plan would fail in the end? What would he do? She found that other than the smooth beginning, the process and the ending were particularly bad. She had almost unleashed her true Tao form when facing off against the two paramount heavenly gods earlier. If it weren't for Enlin's appearance, she would have died a long time ago. Now that the paramount heavenly god of life was targeting her, there was no chance for her to escape. Could it be that he really had to use his Tao form here? No, I can't use it here. An unyielding and hopeful light erupted from the heavenly light goddess' eyes. Ultimate deity art, light of two realms. The purplish golden light dazzled the heavens. With an extremely terrifying speed and extremely powerful aura, it continued forward and fled into the distance. It was also at this moment that the attacks of the three paramount heavenly gods descended like rain. The energies of the Empyrean gods clashed, causing the entire continent to shake. The heaven-crushing united army atop Yutong City was stunned once again. They were already prepared to sacrifice themselves, so why were these paramount heavenly gods suddenly fighting one another? Was civil war that fun? It was so fun that they didn't even want to give up the enemy's base camp, which had the weakest defenses and didn't have any super top-class combat power. In any case, the heaven-crushing army couldn't understand. However, this didn't affect their happiness. It would be best if the four paramount heavenly gods perished together. That way, there wouldn't be a need to fight this battle. The pursuit of a paramount heavenly god was still ongoing. Fortunately, the battle would no longer affect Yutong Divine City. This was because the beam of purple and golden light was flying toward the east, and the spell techniques unleashed by the three heavenly gods were also leaning toward the east. The heaven-crushing alliance's troops watched the battle nervously. They didn't know when this battle was going to conclude. However, they knew that the outcome of this battle would definitely change the direction of the entire Tai Chu continent and alarm all living beings on the Tai Chu continent. Within the divine mirror world, Enlin was situated in a vast expanse of darkness. His consciousness gradually became clear, and he felt like his entire body was being torn apart. This was the after effects of his injuries following the conclusion of the battle. If he wanted to recover, he would most likely have to rest for a very long time. Enlin didn't care about that, and he opened his eyes with great difficulty. The most important thing now was to figure out the current situation. That's right, he couldn't rest yet. He had to recover as soon as possible before returning. Otherwise, Yutong City would be in an extremely perilous situation. However, when Enlin struggled to open his eyes, he was greeted by a sight that left him a little dazed. Scorching winds swept toward him like sharp blades. He was greeted by the sight of a vast expanse of yellow sand. He sat up to discover that the ground beneath him was scorching sand, and he was greeted by a series of connected sand dunes that were shimmering with golden light. The scorching sun in the sky scorched the earth mercilessly. The parched air, the scorching sand, the barren and barren land, as well as the gale-force winds sweeping up sand and dust, all revealed just how harsh this place was. "I'm in a desert." And Lin was a little dumbstruck. He recalled that Tina had dragged him into this place. As the goddess of creation, it was one thing for Tina to not place him in a celestial realm with abundant vital energy, but she should at least give him a room and a living room, right? What was she trying to do by leaving him in the middle of a barren desert? Little Na, where are you?" And Lin yelled at the top of his lungs. His voice reverberated throughout the desert before being drowned out by the wind and sand. He could actually use his power to amplify his voice, but he knew that using his power now would affect his recovery, so he decided against it. "Jine and Lin, I'm here." A crisp voice sounded from a distance. An indescribably beautiful elven woman ran toward him from a distance. She had a pair of bright green eyes, a tall and straight nose, a pair of long and slender ears, a pair of delicate, cherry-like lips, and a pair of wings that were as thin as cicada wings, yet glowing with a holy golden light. Everything was so familiar. Tina's human form was simply too beautiful. However, why would such a beautiful elf woman be holding on to two ugly, fat, and weird mice? "What are you?" And Lin's eyes widened as he looked at Tina, holding onto the tails of one of the mice with an adorable and innocent smile on her face. He was even more confused than when Tina refused to give him a room and a living room. This was way too weird. "Oh, you're talking about this?" Tina picked up one of the mice before her, and it squeaked with all its might as green liquid flowed from its gaping mouth. A dainty smile appeared on Tina's face. "It took me a long time to find these. They're called wild sand mice, and they're very delicious. They're much more delicious than those sand snakes and poisonous centipedes." The elven woman praised excitedly with a smug look on her face, as if she was drooling with desire. And Lin's mouth gaped open, and his mind went completely blank. The goddess of creation ate mice? What the F***CK was going on? Weren't all returned to void stage mighty figures capable of fasting? Why did Tina eat such an ugly wild gerbil? Could it be that this mouse really was delicious? Did Tina want him to taste the local specialties of the divine mirror world? And Lin could see that Tina couldn't wait to start a fire, so he speculated that this was most likely the case. After a long while, Tina finally finished roasting the mice. "Come, Jine and Lin, have a taste." Tina handed a fat roast mouse to Lin. And Lin accepted the roast mouse and bit into it with anticipation in his eyes. A peculiar sourness and stickiness suddenly welled up in his mouth. "PFFF. Tui tui tui. What's this taste?" And Lin spat out the mouthful of food in front of him. Chapter 2189. The rabid sandhog looked very plump, but it tasted sour and astringent. It couldn't even compare to the groundhogs he had roasted in the United University of Cultivation. Tina's heart ached at the sight of Lin spitting out the meat on the ground. It's such a waste to spit it out. How can you let it go to waste? And Lin was stunned to see Tina open her mouth to bite down on the roasted rat, and he hurriedly reached out to stop her idiotic actions. "Wait, little Na, what's wrong? Tell me, what's going on?" There was a pained expression on Lin's face as he looked at the young female elf before him. Tina blinked her bright eyes in confusion at Lin. "What do you mean, Jine and Lin? What are you talking about?" And Lin pointed at the ugly rabid sand hog with an enraged expression. You didn't have this kind of taste in the past. Why do you want to eat this? You're the goddess of creation. What immortal food can't you eat? In the past, you ate spirit fruits like jelly beans. You've fallen." Tina cocked her head to the side with confusion etched on her face. Immortal food? Spirit fruit? What are you talking about?" She pointed at herself with a slender finger. "You're saying I'm the goddess of creation? What's a goddess of creation?" And Lin's mouth gaped open as he stared blankly at Tina. "Little Na, What? What's wrong with you? A dainty smile appeared on Tina's face. Jine and Lin, I don't even know my own name, but for some reason, I feel like you call me Little Na. Boom! These words were like a bolt of lightning striking in Lin's mind. And Lin's eyes widened as countless speculations flashed through his mind. He stared at the woman before him with incredulity in his eyes. Little Na, why you've even forgotten your own name? You lost your memory. Tina blinked her dark green eyes and nodded. I think so. I've been in this desert for as long as I can remember. I don't know who I am or where I came from, but occasionally there will be some messy memories in my mind, such as memories of spells, memories of languages. And Lin shuddered and pointed at himself. You don't know your own name, but you know mine, and you even took the initiative to save me? Tina replied excitedly. That's when I suddenly felt a sense of unease in this world, as if someone very important to me was in danger. Then, I followed the guidance of the chi activity in my bloodline and came to your world. Then, I saved you. As for your name, I just blurted it out. It was instinctive. She took in Lin's hand, and her beautiful eyes were full of curiosity. I also want to ask you. I feel that you are very important to me, and we are connected by blood. What is our relationship? Are you my father? I'm Lin. And Lin almost threw up a mouthful of blood upon hearing this. F***CK. Even his beast pet was going to make him a father? And Lin looked at the fairy before him, and at the pure and flawless expression in her eyes. You're my friend, a very, very good friend. Oh, so you're friends. Tina was enlightened upon hearing this, and a wide smile appeared on her face. That's great. I have a new friend. She latched onto Lin's hand with a smile on her face. Let's go. I'll take you to see my other friends. And Lin's heart jolted with shock. So, Tina had other friends? In that case, would he be able to learn more information from Tina's friends? Before Lin could refuse, Tina grabbed Lin's hand and flew into the sky toward a certain direction in her memory. And Lin looked down at the desert from above, only to find that it stretched as far as the eye could see. He didn't know just how big this desert was. They flew along the way, and there was no special scenery to be seen. It was extremely barren and monotonous, and the wind was blowing sand into their faces. And Lin was completely unable to imagine why Tina would choose to live in an environment like this. Jine and Lin, we're here. Tina and Lin landed on a pile of rubble. There were a series of cracked stone pillars lying all over the place, and there were also many dilapidated houses that had been eroded by the wind and sand. There was still no sign of human habitation or living beings. Glug, glug, glug. Moo, moo. A few burly pig-shaped monsters ran over with elation. There was also a huge rhinoceros that was covered in flames and had rough skin and thick flesh. It also ran over happily. Squeak, 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 squeak. A bald eagle with feathers like steel blades flew over Tina's head. Let me introduce them to you. This is the wild sand black pig, this is the fire demon cow, and this is the sharp steel eagle. They're all my friends, Tina introduced with a joyful expression. Glug, glug, glug. Moo. Sizzle, sizzle. All of Tina's friends greeted each other with elation. And Lin, he had initially wanted to ask Tina's friends what was going on. However, it looked like he had been far too naive. Tina's friends didn't even know how to speak, and Lin was on the verge of tears as he looked at the black pig before him. Asking a pig to speak to him? Wasn't that a joke? What had happened to Tina? How had Tina gone from a cute and intelligent little girl to a cute and retarded little girl in less than a year? And Lin was extremely distressed. He recalled that the last time he saw Tina, she had told him that she was going to upgrade the Divine Mirror World. During that battle in the Divine Mirror World, many Tao integration stage, super mighty figures, and heavenly gods had fallen, thereby drastically enhancing the development of the Divine Mirror World. Theoretically speaking, the Divine Mirror World should have become a world capable of giving birth to Tao integration stage, super mighty figures. But why had Tina become like this? Could it be that the Divine Mirror World had failed to evolve? Jine and Lin, come here. Let's ride on a pig together. A ridiculously beautiful fairy galloped toward Lin atop a huge black pig. Thus, Lin and Tina galloped through the desert atop the huge black pig. They were living a carefree life. No. And Lin suddenly came to a sudden realization. This was a bizarre scene, no matter how he looked at it. Riding atop the black pig, and Lin no longer cared about anything that might affect his recovery. He immediately unleashed his divine sense to examine Tina's body. His divine sense enveloped the fairy's body, and the results of his inspection gave Lin a massive shock. And Lin was completely rooted to the spot. Tina, your cultivation base is already at the goddess of creation stage. And Lin let loose a cry of surprise. Goddess of creation stage? What's that? Tina was at a loss. And Lin was astonished. Logically speaking, if a living being in the divine mirror world could progress to the return to void stage, then Tina should be able to instantly progress to the return to void pinnacle stage. Now, that a living being in the divine mirror world could progress to the Tao integration stage, then Tina should be able to instantly progress to the Tao integration pinnacle stage. How is she already at the goddess of creation stage? Furthermore, after Lin used the power of the heavenly Tao, he discovered that Tina's goddess of creation stage cultivation base had an ancient aura to it, indicating that she was a veteran goddess of creation stage, super mighty figure. What the hell happened to Tina? Chapter 2190. Two huge black pigs galloped through the desert, kicking up clouds of dust and sand. And Lin fell into deep thought after recovering from his astonishment. Just what had happened in the past year. Little Na, have you been living in that pile of rubble all this time? And Lin couldn't help but ask. Tina thought for a moment before replying, sometimes I live in that pile of rubble, and sometimes I just sleep in a sand dune. And Lin, you don't even live in a house? You don't even want a bed? And Lin was astonished. Why would I want a bed in a house? Tina pointed at the boundless desert with a perplexed expression. This entire ground can be my bed. Other animals don't dare to come near me anyway, so I could just find a place to lie down. And Lin's mouth gaped open, but he was at a loss for words. He suddenly understood why Tina had dumped him in the desert. So in the eyes of this fairy, the desert could be used as a bed? The mighty goddess of creation had actually fallen to the point where she had to sleep in the wilderness? It's just that the wind is very strong sometimes, and when I wake up, my entire body will be covered in sand. That's a little troublesome, Tina added. And Lin's heart jolted upon hearing this. Holy Mother of God, that's a little troublesome? Tina's brain was damaged, and Lin's heart ached at the sight of Tina's deranged state, but he was also at a loss for what to do. And Lin knew that he couldn't rush this. He had to find out what had caused Tina to become like this, then try to help her recover. The two of them continued to gallop through the desert. Tina seemed to really enjoy riding pigs. Sometimes she would even stand on the backs of the pigs and look up at the spectacular sight of the red sun disappearing into the horizon. A goddess of creation riding a pig, and she seemed to be enjoying herself. She reminded Lin of the wild children she had played with when she was little. Sigh, little Na, I still don't understand why you chose to live in a desert instead of a place with beautiful scenery, and Lin continued. Beautiful scenery? Tina cocked her head to the side. Is there a place with beautiful scenery in this world? And Lin was astonished again. How could there not be? The divine mirror world is huge. There really isn't, Tina replied earnestly. It's all desert. And Lin once again used the power within his body and released his divine sense. This time, he did not pay attention to the details and only paid attention to the range. His divine sense quickly spread out for thousands of kilometers, and it turned out that it really was a huge desert. And Lin was unwilling to give up. He continued to expand his divine sense, reaching 10,000 li. In the end, he observed a desert that spanned tens of thousands of miles. He crazily expanded his divine sense. 100,000 miles, 1,000,000 miles, several million miles. If this were in the past, he would have explored the entire divine mirror world a long time ago. However, he still couldn't see the end of it. None of that mattered anymore. More importantly, when Lin used his divine sense to its limit, all he saw was a desert, Even the largest desert on the Taichu continent was less than a tenth of the size of the desert in the divine mirror world. This meant that what Tina had said was very likely true. How did it become like this? And Lin's expression was a little dazed. Where had the divine mirror world in his mind, which was filled with countless tribes, vibrant with vitality and innumerable natural wonders, gone? Right at this moment, two black boars carried Lin and Tina to a certain place. This was an extremely massive city that had been obscured by a sandstorm, and Lin could see all types of roofs as well as tall towers. As for the lower half of the buildings and the ground of the city, they had already been buried underground by the boundless sandstorm. That's right, this was a city that had been obscured by a sandstorm. And Lin and Tina dismounted from the wild boar and walked into the city. This city was extremely massive, spanning over 50 kilometers in length. However, in contrast to its grandeur, this place was extremely desolate. Desolate? This was far too desolate. There was nothing here. All they could see was desolation and decay. And Lin made his way toward a tall tower that had not been buried by the sandstorm, and he could see some signs of life within it. He saw some special beings, and he could tell from their silhouettes that they were members of the Lightwing clan. There were several hundred Lightwing clan members on the tall tower, and all of them seemed to have been petrified. Their bodies were made up of a tough and decayed substance, and their wings were snapped off. They looked up at the sky with despair and confusion on their faces, and their vitality had been completely severed. All of the Lightwing clan members were clustered together, either praying or shedding tears toward the sky. Their bodies had been corroded by a strange power, and they had been petrified. This was a scene of sorrow and despair, but it also seemed to be an extremely ancient scene. This made Lin feel extremely uneasy. Is this the apocalypse? What has happened to the divine mirror world? Why has it changed so much in the short span of a year? And Lin murmured to himself. Tina's innocent smile gradually disappeared as an indescribable sense of sorrow welled up in her heart. She was a little perplexed upon hearing Lin's words. What short span of a year? It had clearly been a very, very long time. If the sun rose and set as one day, then how many years had it been since little Na had been here? 100 years? 10,000 years? 100,000 years? Or 1,000,000 years? It's been far, far too long. Little Na doesn't even know how much time has passed. Ever since little Na can remember, everything has been like this. Tina spoke in a soft voice, as if she were recounting something that had happened a long, long time ago. This place has always been like this. The desert, the sun, the gale force winds, and the sandstorm. I've walked from one end of the world to the other, but I haven't found a single living being that I can speak to. All I've seen are ordinary desert creatures. I've been blown away by the wind and scorched by the sun. When I'm bored, I'll go hunting and find food. After that, I'll make a few silly friends. Day after day, year after year, and there's no end in sight. I've actually become numb to this for a very long time. I've become numb to the endless repetition of this life. I thought this was what it meant to be alive. She clasped a hand over her heart and lowered her head. Giant and Lin, did you know? I was ecstatic when I suddenly discovered that my bloodline was reacting to someone else's. At that time, I suddenly discovered that I wasn't alone. I was in another world, and there were other people that I was connected to, and Lin looked at the elven woman beside him. She didn't seem to want Lin to see her feeble and disheveled state, so she lowered her head. However, translucent tears were already flowing from the corners of her eyes, but they instantly disappeared as soon as they fell to the ground. Even though he had countless questions, and Lin wasn't going to pry any further, he merely pulled the elven woman into his arms and held her tightly. Little Na, it's all right now. I'm here now, aren't I? I'll always be with you. You won't be bored anymore. And Lin consoled her in a gentle voice. He could sense the elven woman's loneliness and unease. Who could live in such an environment forever? Tina's body wasn't the only thing that was being tortured, and Lin felt as if his heart were being squeezed by something. Chapter 2191. Tina accepted Lin's hug in a very natural manner. To put it more accurately, she was hoping that Lin would hug her for a little longer. This type of warmth and familiarity was something that she had experienced a long, long time ago, and she was extremely nostalgic about it. Thank you very much, Giant and Lin. Little Na is very happy to have true friends from now on. Tina rested her head on Lin's shoulder, and a smile appeared on her face again. And Lin stroked little Na's soft golden hair. I've always been a very, very good friend of yours. I'm sorry for making you suffer so much, but I'll definitely find a way to help you recover. To his surprise, Tina shook her head with a sweet smile. It's all right, it's all in the past now. All you have to do is treat me well and don't leave me in the future. And Lin's heart fell into a daze at the sight of her mesmerizing smile. This little girl was so obedient that it made his heart ache for her. Little Na had to have seen how terrifying this world was and felt that helping him recover his memories would only bring him bad things. So she refused to do so. No, you're extremely important to me, so you have to listen to me. And Lin spoke with a firm expression. He used his divine sense to survey Tina's body again as he spoke. Tina's cultivation base was indeed at the God of Creation stage, and it was an extremely ancient God of Creation stage cultivation base that could only be described as unfathomable. However, her power was extremely dispirited and completely dried up. She was like a dried-up well without any source water. She only had her cultivation and nothing else. This was very strange indeed. If it weren't for the fact that they were connected by blood and that her appearance and aura were so realistic, and Lin would have suspected that this young fairy was his Little Na. Little Na, is your current level of authority over the divine mirror world complete? And Lin thought about it for a moment before deciding to analyze this from another perspective. Authority over the divine mirror world? What's that? Tina blinked in confusion, and Lin was speechless. You don't even know the level of authority you have. So how did you transmigrate to save me? Not only that, but you also evaded the pursuit of a paramount heavenly god? I just somehow sensed your location. Then, I broke the barrier between the two worlds without any hesitation and pulled you into my world without any hesitation. I even closed the passage between the worlds. All of this was driven by instinct and some kind of stress reaction. Tina's eyes lit up as she spoke. Giant and Lin, you really are very important to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done something like this for you. She was now even more certain that the man before her was extremely important to her. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been in such a hurry to meet him and drag him into her divine mirror world. Driven by instinct, Lin was deep in thought. The fact that you have the ability to break and close the passage between the two worlds proves that you still have the authority, or rather, you have part of the authority, but you have forgotten how to use it. Let's go, Little Na. Show me around this divine mirror world. I want to see if there's any way I can help you recover your memories. And Lin felt like recovering Tina's memories was the most important thing right now. That way, all of the mysteries would most likely be solved. Tina wasn't going to refuse Lin's request. She spread open her wings and began to fly around the divine mirror world with Lin in tow. They flew from north to south, then from east to west. The divine mirror world was very, very big, and Lin could only see a barren desert along the way, as well as the ruins of all types of living beings that were almost completely obscured by the dust and sand. What was most astonishing to him were the ruins of the human kingdom. This was a highly civilized place with many extravagant buildings that peer straight into the heavens. There were all types of man-made structures that were simply breathtaking, and some lifeless equipment was still operating even now. However, just like the other races, there were no signs of life in these places. There were no signs of life from any highly intelligent living beings. They had all become fossils like the ones Lin had seen in the ruins of the Lightwing clan. Despair and sorrow were the main themes of this world. It was very difficult to imagine what it must have been like for Tina to wander around this world with nothing but despair and sorrow before her eyes after losing her memories. All of the living beings had been reduced to something akin to fossils. However, Lin also discovered that the number of living beings that had been reduced to fossils was extremely low. This was a city of over 10 million people, but he could only sense a few hundred fossils. Where did the rest of the people go? Could it be that they had all disappeared in a thin air? Or could it be that those people had already been reduced to dust by the sandstorm? And Lin discovered that the more he investigated this world, the more mysteries he discovered. He hammered the space around him to find that the space here was almost as hard as the Tai Chu continent. This was very astonishing. At the very least, this proved that this world was very close to the Tai Chu continent. A few days later, Lin arrived at the center of the divine mirror world. This was also the center of the boundless desert. He discovered a gargantuan ocean. The ocean was inky black in color, and there was extremely dense energy flowing within it. The entire ocean was extremely poisonous, and no living beings could survive in this ocean. At a certain place along the coast of the Sea of Darkness, Lin discovered an extremely gargantuan dragon skeleton. Just the dragon skeleton alone was over 1,000 kilometers long, forming a massive, winding mountain range. The skeleton was still indestructible even after countless years of use. And Lin sensed the skeleton carefully and was astonished to discover that this dragon was a god of creation stage being. What did this prove? This proved that the living beings of this world were extremely close to the Tai Chu continent. After all, even a god of creation had once existed here. This was definitely something that Lin had never seen or heard of in all of the worlds he had seen and heard of. Just what had happened to the divine mirror world? How had a world like this been destroyed? No, that wasn't the point. The point was, how had the divine mirror world experienced so much in just a single year? Logically speaking, there was no way that a world as developed as this could be so different from the Tai Chu continent. And Lin's mind raced, but he couldn't think of a reason no matter how hard he tried. Tina immediately offered words of consolation. It's all right, Jine and Lin. Let's not think about this anymore. What happened in the past isn't important. What's important is whether little Na is doing well now. She held onto Lin's hand with a smile. Little Na is doing very well here. You can chat with me, Jine and Lin, and we can eat all of the delicacies in this world. We can find delicacies like rabid gerbils. And Lin almost threw up a mouthful of blood upon hearing this. Find delicacies like rabid gerbils? Little Na, what have you been through these past few years? Chapter 2192. And Lin was on the verge of tears at the sight of Tina's adorable and innocent expression, and he really couldn't bear to tell her the truth. The dishes that Tina was referring to, such as roasted spiders and wild sand rats, were definitely some of the most ghastly dishes on the Tai Chu continent. Jine and Lin, there are many more interesting things to explore in the divine mirror world. Let's go for a stroll. Tina latched onto Lin's hand with an excited expression. And Lin had been to so many places, but he really hadn't seen anything interesting or fun. Of course, if Tina could say that riding a black pig was fun, then there were indeed a lot of things to play with in this world. At the very least, there were a lot of strange creatures that could be kept as pets for fun. Jine and Lin, we can go to the heavenly white jade rock to see the spectacular scene of vital energy being compressed into a rainbow rain. We can go to the purple sand basin to see the battle of the century between billions of ants and purple crystal sandworms. We can also go to the Snake Rock Peak to see the peculiar scene of sandstorms being blasted into colorful sandstorms by divine lightning. Tina introduced all the beautiful sceneries in the world as if she was counting her family treasures. She even knew where to stand and which angle to view the scenery from. God knew how many times she had seen those sceneries. And Lin felt more and more guilty as he listened. Little Na, let's go out, okay? And Lin suddenly suggested. Go out? Where are we going? Tina stared at Lin with a confused expression. To the world that I live in, the Tai Chu continent. And Lin replied with a serious expression. Tina's eyelids trembled slightly. The world that Giant and Lin lives in? But I've lived here for so long. This world is where I was born and raised. I have many fun places here, and we can have a lot of fun here. We don't necessarily have to go to the Tai Chu continent. The young fairy maiden looked at the man before her, as if she was trying to salvage something from him. And Lin could empathize with Tina's current emotions. This was the place where she had lived for countless years. No matter how harsh the environment was, Even if there were all sorts of flaws and shortcomings, it was still very meaningful to her. Little Na, I'm not asking you to leave this place forever. I just want to take you to the Tai Chu continent to have some fun. It's like a vacation, understand? And Lin spoke in a gentle voice. There are many fun places to visit on the Tai Chu continent. The celestial court has boundless rainbow clouds to look at. The creation realm has all types of strange-looking living beings to broaden your horizons. The spirit lake realm has many extremely comfortable hot springs. The southern heavenly wing nation has all types of divine and immortal trees that reach into the clouds. And the realm of the fallen phoenix has a boundless grassland with blue skies and green grass. Tina was initially reluctant, but as she heard a series of new terms and things that she had never heard of before, her initially reluctant eyes gradually lit up, revealing a burning curiosity and thirst for knowledge. And Lin calmed down a little when he saw the elf girl's reaction. No matter what Tina had been through, she was still the same little Na that craved new things and loved to experience different things. Really? Is everything you're saying true? Are there really so many fun things to see on the Tai Chu continent? You're not lying to me, are you? Tina was a little uneasy, and Lin bent down and looked into Tina's bright eyes. He even poked her delicate cheek with a smile. Of course it's true. You're my best friend. Why would I lie to you? He extended a hand toward Tina. Little Na, the light of the setting sun shone down upon the two of them. The light of the setting sun made Lin's figure appear particularly warm and warm. Come with me. I promised you that I would take you to see the most beautiful scenery in this world. This promise is valid forever. To see the most beautiful scenery in this world. Tina's heart jolted as she looked at the man before her. All of the memories that had been sealed away in her mind suddenly exploded, crashing into her consciousness like a tidal wave. That one sentence was an opportunity. It passed through boundless space and time before overlapping in that instant. Jine and Lin, I'm back. Phew, such fresh air. Let me tell you, I'm already at the Tao integration pinnacle stage. I can even help in a battle against a heavenly god or a paramount heavenly god. Huh. Goodbye, little Tion, little Goo, big sister Han, what's with your expressions? Where's Jine and Lin? The atmosphere became extremely heavy. Lil Tion didn't say any idioms, curled up on the ground with an autistic face, and didn't say a word. Dabai's tears were streaming down his face. Little Goo hung her head. Little Hong looked up into the sky. Master, he's already dead, and the battle is over. What are you talking about? The smile on Tina's face instantly disappeared as she stared at her friends with astonishment etched on her face. Big Brother and was surrounded by the 4 paramount heavenly gods, and he used his final life sacrifice to defeat the 4 paramount heavenly gods, but his own life was also erased. The power of darkness returned to the heavenly Tao and became an inanimate object. In the end, Nuam mended the heavens. It's over, it's all over. Master has left us forever. Each and every word was like a blade stabbing into the fairy's heart, making her vision blur with pain. Tina shook her head relentlessly, and her eyes seemed to have lost all of their luster for the first time. No, impossible. How could Jine and Lin die? I don't believe this. This is absolutely impossible. Little Na, haven't you noticed? The beast pet contract between you and Master has already disappeared. Little Goose sobbed. Tina's features instantly turned extremely pale. He promised me that he would take me to see all of the beautiful sights in this world. He hasn't even fulfilled that promise. So how could he abandon me? How could he leave me? Liar. You big liar. The fairy wore a flowery dress and sat alone on the summit of the full moon mountain. She looked at the moon rising and setting, as well as the spring flowers and winter snow. She looked up into the sky as the darkness merged into the heavenly Tao. She didn't think that things would end up like this. She didn't expect that the hurried departure, the brief departure without any warning, would suddenly become an eternal farewell. After the tribulation, hope reignited in the world. All things began to recover, and a series of new legends were born. However, Lin was the only legend that no one could surpass. The 4-9 Immortal sect was still the most dazzling and powerful force on the Tai Chu continent. In fact, it was the #1 holy land for countless prodigies on the entire Tai Chu continent. However, the Realm Pavilion Lord seemed to have been a legend forever. Only the members of the 4-9 Immortal sect knew that there was a fairy who had been looking up into the sky on the full moon mountain every day for a very, very long time. Hey, Jian and Lin, you've only become the Heavenly Tao, right? There must be a way to save you, right? I'm also the Heavenly Tao, and I'm also a god of creation. If I can exist as a living being, then you can too, right? I don't have the ability to interfere with the Heavenly Tao of the Tai Chu continent right now, as my rank is too low. But what if the Heavenly Tao of the Divine Mirror world is more powerful than the Tai Chu continent? I can do it. I can definitely do it. No matter what price I have to pay, no matter how long it takes, I'll make you appear before me again. I won't give up. Wait for me, Jian and Lin.